Long before the samurai became symbols of honor and legend, Japan was a land of shifting loyalties and quiet chaos. The islands were ruled in name by the emperor in Kyoto, but in truth, power flowed through the hands of the noble families who owned the land. The shogun, great estates scattered across misty valleys and mountain plains. It was the late Heian period, the 10th and 11th centuries, when poetry and politics danced side by side in the imperial court. Men wrote verses about moonlight and love, while beyond the palace walls, swordsmen began to rise, protectors of land, guardians of law, and soon, the makers of history. These men were the first samurai, a word meaning those who serve. They began as retainers, bodyguards for aristocrats, enforcers of local authority, but in the uncertain tides of the age, they grew into something far greater. Clad in lamellar armor made from lacquered leather and iron plates, mounted on swift horses, they became a new breed of warrior. They were disciplined, precise, and deeply loyal to their lords, whom they served not for coin, but for duty. In the stillness of dawn, they would bow before their banners, whisper oaths to the gods, and ride into the mist knowing their place was not their own, but part of a greater order, a harmony between life and death. In the provinces, far from the elegance of Kyoto's golden halls, power began to fracture. Local clans, like the Taira and the Minamoto, rose to prominence, wielding their samurai like the emperor once wielded words. What began as servants of nobles became the very force that would reshape Japan's destiny. Each clan was bound by loyalty, not to a distant ruler in silk robes, but to a lord who shared their battles and blood. It was here that the seed of Bushido, the way of the warrior, first took root. It was not yet written in books or carved in stone, but it lived in the quiet courage of men who lived and died by honor alone. The early samurai lived simple lives between moments of chaos. They trained relentlessly, practiced archery on horseback, learned poetry and calligraphy, and prayed to the kami, the spirits that lived in trees, rivers, and winds. To them, war was not just about conquest. It was about balance. To strike down an enemy without losing oneself to hatred, that was the true mastery. And yet, as the centuries turned, peace was no longer enough. Rival clans grew stronger, ambition burned brighter, and the sword began to eclipse the pen. The emperor's court, lost in art and ceremony, could not hold back the rising tide. The age of the samurai had truly begun, and with it, Japan would enter 1,000 years of shifting power, loyalty, and legend. So, as you close your eyes, imagine the first dawn over ancient Japan. The mist curls over rice fields, and the silhouettes of mounted warriors appear through the fog, banners rippling softly, blades glinting faintly in the light. The world is young, the code is unspoken, and the path of the samurai stretches endlessly into the future. As the sun climbed higher over medieval Japan, the peace of the Heian court began to wane. The emperor's words no longer carried the same power they once had, and the great nobles in Kyoto found themselves outmatched by the strength of provincial warlords. From the scattered provinces came two names that would forever shape Japan's destiny: Taira and Minamoto. These clans were not mere samurai houses. They were dynasties of ambition, descended from emperors yet hardened by war and the wild lands they ruled. Between them burned a rivalry so deep, it would divide the nation and give birth to a new era. The Taira, elegant and proud, controlled the sea routes and the rich western provinces. Their leader, Taira no Kayamori, rose not just through bloodshed, but through cunning and diplomacy. He was the first samurai to truly rule from Kyoto itself, standing among the nobles as an equal, a man of war, commanding the world of peace. He built temples, sponsored poets, and married his family into the imperial line. But power breeds envy, and the Taira grew arrogant in their wealth, seeing themselves as untouchable. In the shadows, the Minamoto bided their time. The Minamoto clan, rugged and disciplined, held the eastern provinces, a land of mountains, storms, and stubborn hearts. Their warriors were forged in hardship, their spirits unbending. While the Taira dressed in silks and ruled the court, the Minamoto honed their swords, training in the forests and valleys that echoed with the cries of crows and the clash of steel. They were not men of politics, they were soldiers of destiny. And destiny, as Japan would soon learn, favored those who endured. In 1180, the long-brewing storm finally broke. A prince, exiled and desperate, called upon the Minamoto for aid against the tyranny of the Taira. The call to arms echoed through the land. From rice fields to mountaintops, banners rose and the drums of war thundered. It was the beginning of the Genpei War, a conflict that would plunge Japan into years of chaos and reshape it forever. Samurai met samurai across burning fields and narrow bridges, where honor was measured not by birth, but by the calm courage to face death without fear. The Taira fought with the confidence of those who believed themselves chosen by the heavens, while the Minamoto fought with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose. Battles raged across the islands, the roar of arrows, the thunder of hooves, the crash of waves as ships burned at sea. The war was not only fought with swords, but with cunning. Each victory came at terrible cost, and each defeat was a lesson written in blood. At last, the tides of fate turned. The Taira fled to the sea, their banners torn, their empire crumbling. In 1185, at the Battle of Dan-no-Ura, the final reckoning came. The sea was black with ships, the air thick with arrows. As the Minamoto forces closed in, the Taira line broke. Legends tell of empresses and nobles casting themselves into the waves, taking the imperial child with them, the sea swallowing an age in silence. When the waters calmed, the Taira were gone, and the Minamoto stood victorious. From the ashes of that war, Japan would be reborn. The emperor still sat upon his throne, but the real power now rested in the hands of the samurai. For the first time in history, a warrior, Minamoto no Yoritomo, would rule Japan not as emperor, but as shogun. The court of Kyoto had fallen silent, and the age of the sword had begun. So, as you drift further into the story, imagine the waves of Dan-no-Ura glimmering under the pale morning light, banners sinking beneath the surface, the cries of warriors fading into eternity. From the sea rose a new order, and the spirit of the samurai, once servants, had become the masters of Japan. When the echoes of the Genpei War faded, Japan entered a new dawn, not one of peace, but of transformation. The flames that consumed the old world had forged something entirely new, the Kamakura Shogunate, the first military government in Japanese history. The age of courtiers and poets gave way to the rule of men in armor, men who carried the weight of their nation on the sharp edge of their blades. And at the center of it all stood Minamoto no Yoritomo, the first shogun, a man whose vision and restraint would define an era. Yoritomo did not rule from Kyoto, the shimmering heart of the old aristocracy. Instead, he turned his gaze eastward, to the rugged coastlines and mist-shrouded mountains of Kamakura. It was there, far from the temptations of courtly life, that he built his government. Kamakura was no city of gold or marble. It was a fortress of simplicity and discipline. The ocean guarded one side, and mountains the other. Nature itself seemed to bow before the shogun's will. From this isolated seat of power, the samurai would govern Japan for centuries. The emperor remained in Kyoto, his role now largely symbolic. The true power rested in the hands of the shogun and his network of loyal vassals. The Bakufu, or tent government, was born, a military administration where loyalty was rewarded and betrayal was unforgivable. Samurai who had once fought for glory now served as bureaucrats, magistrates, and provincial stewards, maintaining order in the name of the shogun. The ideals of Bushido, loyalty, discipline, and honor became not just a warrior's creed, but the foundation of governance itself. Yet even as order settled over the land, shadows began to gather. The Minamoto lineage, though victorious, was fragile. Rivalries simmered among Yoritomo's kin, and suspicion clouded the air like distant thunder. When Yoritomo died in 1199, the question of power ignited once more. His widow, Hojo Masako, a woman of unshakable resolve, stepped into the void. Known to history as the Nun Shogun, Masako and her family, the Hojo clan, would become the true power behind the shogunate, ruling through careful manipulation and ruthless decisiveness. Under Hojo rule, the samurai class grew more structured, more defined. The shogunate introduced systems of land distribution and law enforcement that kept the provinces in line and curbed the ambitions of rebellious lords. For the first time, Japan began to resemble a unified military state, one bound by the sword, yet guided by duty. Monks chronicled this era in silent monasteries, where the sound of prayer mingled with the wind. The shogun's banners fluttered against the dawn, symbols of a new order that valued action over words, simplicity over luxury, and honor over life itself. But the peace of Kamakura was not eternal. From across the seas, beyond the horizon, an unimaginable threat loomed, one that would test the very soul of the samurai. In the distant steppes of Asia, a storm of conquest was rising under the banner of the Mongols. News of their approach rippled Japan like a whisper of doom. The samurai prepared themselves for a war unlike any they had known, not against rival clans, but against an empire that sought to devour the world. For now, however, Kamakura stood proud. Its temples gleamed beneath the soft morning light, its samurai patrolled the coasts, and its people prayed for protection. In their hearts burned a quiet faith that the gods who had granted them victory over the Taira would not abandon them now. The sword had become not only a weapon but a symbol, a reflection of discipline, devotion, and the fragile balance between power and humility. As you close your eyes, picture Kamakura at dawn, waves whispering against the shore, banners swaying gently in the sea breeze, and monks chanting in the distance. The world has changed. The emperor sleeps in Kyoto's fading glory, while the shogun's shadow stretches across Japan. The age of the samurai has begun in full, and beneath their silent watch, history itself holds its breath. The peace that had blanketed Japan under the Kamakura shogunate was deep and steady, like the still surface of a lake. But far to the west, ripples began to stir. Across the vast grasslands of Asia, beneath endless skies, a new empire thundered into being, the Mongol horde. They were unstoppable, a force of nature led first by Genghis Khan and later by his grandson, Kublai Khan, the ruler of the mighty Yuan dynasty of China. Their banners swept across nations like wildfire, devouring kingdoms, silencing empires, and leaving only smoke in their wake. By the late 13th century, their eyes turned eastward toward Japan. At first, the Mongol envoys came not with swords, but with scrolls. They carried letters demanding submission, orders from Kublai Khan himself, declaring that the shogun and emperor should recognize his supremacy. The letters were written in grand, commanding tones, as if the Mongol ruler were addressing the gods themselves. But Japan did not bow. The Hojo regents, speaking for the shogun, ignored these demands. Their silence was not arrogance, it was resolve. The samurai would not kneel to a foreign emperor. And so, in the year 1274, the storm arrived. Off the coast of Kyushu, dark shapes emerged on the horizon. Hundreds of ships, bristling with soldiers from China, Korea, and Mongolia. The Mongols brought with them weapons the samurai had never seen. Explosive bombs that burst with fire and thunder, heavy armor, and coordinated tactics. As their war drums echoed over the sea, the samurai rode to meet them. But this was not the warfare they were used to, not the honorable duels of clan against clan, where warriors called out their names before striking. The Mongols fought as one body, disciplined and relentless, their arrows falling like rain. The beaches of Hakata became a field of chaos, steel clashing, waves crashing, cries and cannon fire blending into a storm of terror. Yet the samurai stood firm. Even as the Mongols pushed inland, Japan refused to break. The defenders fought through the night, illuminated by burning ships and the glow of the full moon. And then, as if the heavens themselves intervened, the sea began to rise. Winds howled through the darkness, tearing sails, capsizing ships. A typhoon, fierce and sudden, swept across the coast, scattering the Mongol fleet like leaves before the gale. The survivors who limped back to the continent told tales of the fury of Japan's gods. The invaders called it kamikaze, the divine wind. For the Japanese, it was no coincidence. The gods, they believed, had shielded their island from destruction. In temples and shrines across the land, bells tolled in gratitude. Monks wrote of divine protection, and the samurai bowed in reverence. Japan had been tested and spared, but Kublai Khan was not a man to accept defeat. 7 years later, in 1281, he returned with an even greater force, over 4,000 ships and 140,000 men, the largest naval invasion the world had ever seen. The samurai, now seasoned and fortified, awaited them behind newly built walls along Hakata Bay. For weeks, fierce battles raged along the shoreline. The Mongols tried to land, the Japanese repelled them. The sea was thick with ships, arrows, and fire. Then, once again, nature turned its wrath upon the invaders. A second storm, mightier than the first, swept through the fleet. For 2 long days, the typhoon tore apart ships, shattered masts, and drowned entire armies. The night sky flashed with lightning as the waves devoured everything in their path. When dawn came, the waters were silent, littered only with wreckage and the ghosts of an empire's ambition. Once more, Japan had been saved, not by sword or strategy, but by the will of the divine wind. The Mongol threat never returned. The kamikaze became legend, a living symbol of divine favor and national resilience. Yet the cost was immense. The samurai who had defended their homeland found no spoils of war, no lands, no riches. They had fought for survival, not conquest. The shogunate, burdened by the costs of war, began to strain under the weight of its own protection. Still, for the samurai, honor remained their treasure. In the stillness after the storm, they prayed to their ancestors and sharpened their blades once more, not for glory, but for readiness. The sea that had once threatened them now whispered like a guardian spirit, its rhythm echoing through the centuries. Close your eyes now and imagine the endless ocean, the scent of salt, the whisper of wind through pine trees, and the faint clang of distant armor. The divine wind has passed. The island sleeps beneath its blessing. The samurai stand watch in silence, their faith unbroken, their hearts bound forever to the storm that saved them. After the chaos of war and the roar of divine winds faded, Japan entered a time of reflection, an age where silence carried more meaning than the clash of steel. The Mongol invasions had proven that strength alone could not preserve a nation. The sword had defended Japan, yes, but something deeper was needed to sustain the soul of its warriors. And from the temples rising in mist-shrouded mountains came a new path, one that blended discipline, meditation, and balance. This was the path of Zen. Zen Buddhism had flowed into Japan from China, where it was known as Chan, carried by wandering monks and learned masters. But here, on these islands shaped by storms and shadowed by mountains, Zen found fertile soil in the hearts of the samurai. Its teachings spoke of simplicity, impermanence, and clarity, of mastering the mind as one would master a blade. To the samurai, this was revelation. In Zen, they discovered not just faith, but a philosophy that mirrored their very essence. A warrior who could still his mind in battle, who could strike without anger and face death without fear. That was the ideal of the samurai soul. Temples began to bloom across the land like quiet sanctuaries of stone and wood. The scent of incense mingled with the sound of flowing water and the soft tapping of bamboo in the wind. Monks meditated in stillness for hours, seeking satori, enlightenment, through the emptiness between thoughts. And samurai came to sit beside them, armored men setting aside their weapons to confront the greater battle within, the war against desire, ego, and illusion. In this way, Zen did not weaken the samurai. It sharpened them, refining brutality into balance, rage into focus, death into acceptance. From these teachings emerged something greater than mere discipline, a code, a way of life, a moral compass that bound all warriors together. It was not written at first, but lived, a spirit passed from master to pupil, from father to son, in the quiet hours before dawn. Later, it would be named Bushido, the way of the warrior. Bushido was not simply about combat. It was about conduct. It taught loyalty above all, to one's lord, one's honor, one's word. It demanded courage in the face of fear, compassion in victory, and serenity in loss. It turned the act of dying into a poem, and the art of living into duty. Bushido was more than ethics. It was beauty in restraint. A samurai who followed it sought harmony in every gesture, from the way he tied his armor to the way he bowed before his enemy. His sword became not a weapon, but an extension of his soul, pure, sharp, unyielding. To draw it without cause was shameful. To use it with purpose was sacred. Death was not an end to be feared, but a fulfillment of one's vow to the world. To die with honor, the old masters said, is to live without regret. Under this philosophy, the samurai became not just fighters but scholars, poets, and patrons of art. They found beauty in imperfection, reverence in transience. A falling leaf, a fleeting sunset, the scent of rain on temple stone. These were no longer mere sensations, but reminders of Mono no aware, the gentle sadness that everything must pass. The sword that once split enemies now also traced calligraphy. The hand that once held a spear could just as easily pour tea with grace. In time, this spiritual discipline shaped all of Japanese culture. Its architecture, its poetry, its painting, its silence. Even the art of the tea ceremony, the stillness of the garden, and the elegance of the brushstroke carried the echo of Bushido. The samurai were no longer merely men of war. They were guardians of balance, warriors of the body and of the mind. Yet this harmony was fragile. Beneath the quiet strength of the Zen gardens, the fires of ambition still smoldered. Clans grew restless. Power shifted like sand. Underfoot, the samurai, no matter how serene their hearts, were still men, and men still desired dominion. The time of meditation would soon give way once again to the march of armies and the thunder of hooves. But before that storm, imagine the stillness. A samurai sits before dawn, his sword resting across his knees. The world is silent but alive, crickets in the grass, the distant rustle of wind through pine. He breathes deeply, eyes closed, heart steady. In his mind, there is no tomorrow, no yesterday. Only this breath, this moment. This is Zen, and this is the eternal soul of Bushido. As Japan's medieval dawn gave way to the shifting light of the 14th century, the land once united under the Kamakura shoguns began to fracture again. Loyalty had been the cornerstone of the samurai world. Yet even loyalty has its breaking point. The emperors in Kyoto, cloaked in ancient ritual but stripped of real authority, longed to reclaim their throne. The samurai, guardians of the realm, were caught between two powers, the divine lineage of the imperial court and the military rule of the shogunate. From this tension, the nation once more fell into the slow-burning chaos of civil war, and in that turmoil, a new order would rise, the Ashikaga shogunate. The Ashikaga clan, descended from the Minamoto, emerged from the storm of ambition and betrayal. Ashikaga Takauji, a man of cunning and charisma, first fought for the emperor's cause but later turned against him, seizing power in a twist of fate that would shape centuries to come. In 1336, he entered Kyoto, not as a servant of the throne but as its master in all but name. Thus began the Muromachi period, named for the district in Kyoto where Takauji established his government, a time when beauty and brutality would intertwine more closely than ever before. Unlike the rigid Kamakura regime, the Ashikaga rule was more refined, more aristocratic, a delicate balance between sword and silk. The shoguns surrounded themselves not only with generals, but with monks, poets, painters, and philosophers. They sought legitimacy not through conquest alone, but through culture, using art to unify what politics could not. Their courts became centers of sophistication, where Zen aesthetics met the elegance of the ancient Heian traditions. The samurai, still warriors at heart, began to cultivate not only martial excellence, but also taste. The brush beside the blade, the flower beside the spear. Kyoto flourished under this strange harmony. The air of the capital shimmered with both ambition and grace. The temples of Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, and Ginkakuji, the Silver Pavilion, rose like dreams out of the still waters that mirrored their gilded reflections. These sanctuaries, commissioned by Ashikaga shoguns, embodied the essence of Zen and impermanence, lavish yet restrained, shining yet somber. Inside their wooden halls, tatami mats muffled the steps of poets and lords, while the faint scent of incense carried prayers into the open rafters. It was here that the Japanese idea of beauty, wabi-sabi, the perfection of imperfection, began to bloom fully, shaped by the samurai mind. Art in all its forms became an expression of balance and introspection. Ink paintings, black on white, form emerging from emptiness, mirrored the simplicity of the warrior's heart. No theater, born in this age, blended poetry, music, and silence into haunting performances that seemed to echo through eternity. The masked actors moved slowly, their gestures deliberate, their words few, their meaning profound. Every pause, every breath, held the weight of centuries, just as a samurai's pause before a strike contained the fate of life and death. To watch No was to meditate on existence itself, to feel time dissolve. And then there was the tea ceremony, perhaps the purest manifestation of Zen and Bushido united. A ritual of utter simplicity, yet bound by precise form. It reflected all that the samurai valued: discipline, humility, and harmony. Within the small tea room, all rank was forgotten. A lord and a retainer, a poet and a monk, all knelt upon the same tatami, their hands steady, their spirits calm. The pouring of water, the whisking of tea, the gentle clink of porcelain. These became an art of awareness, a meditation disguised as hospitality. To master tea was to master oneself. Yet for all its serenity, the Muromachi period was not an age of peace. Beyond Kyoto's tranquil gardens, provinces still clashed, clans still hungered for power, and the emperor's shadow loomed faintly, a reminder of divine legitimacy waiting to be reclaimed. The Ashikaga shoguns were cultured, yes, but not always strong. Their influence often flickered, challenged by ambitious warlords rising in distant provinces, each dreaming of uniting Japan under his own banner. Still, this was an era where the samurai soul found its voice. The brush and the sword no longer stood apart. They danced together, each refining the other. The warrior learned to appreciate transience, and the poet learned the weight of silence. And somewhere between battle and beauty, the Japanese spirit, disciplined, graceful, and unbreakable, took the shape that would define it forever. As the evening mist settled over Kyoto, one could imagine the shogun seated in quiet contemplation, gazing upon the reflection of his pavilion in still water. Behind him, a servant set down a cup of tea. Somewhere in the distance, the hollow tone of a temple bell rolled across the city. In that single sound, calm yet eternal, the heart of samurai Japan beat softly, carrying the promise of both creation and destruction. The delicate harmony of the Ashikaga age, with its golden pavilions and Zen gardens, could not hold forever. Beneath the quiet surface of Kyoto's still ponds and paper-walled palaces, old rivalries smoldered, waiting to ignite. Power in Japan had become a fragile illusion, like the reflection of the moon on water, beautiful yet untouchable. The shoguns, once feared as the supreme military rulers of the realm, now presided over a court of poets and monks while the provinces slipped steadily from their grasp. The samurai lords, bound by ambition and lineage, no longer bowed as readily as they once had. And in 1467, the illusion shattered. It began not with the thunder of battle, but with a question of inheritance. A a succession dispute within the Ashikaga family that spiraled into catastrophe. Two great clans, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, each claimed the right to influence the next shogun. What started as a political quarrel in Kyoto soon erupted into full-scale war, a war that would engulf the city and forever change Japan's destiny. It was called the Unin War, named for the era in which it began, and though it would rage for only a decade, its echoes would be felt for centuries. Kyoto became a battlefield. The city of poets and philosophers was transformed into a smoking ruin. Mansions that once hosted tea ceremonies now housed archers and swordsmen. Temples became fortresses, and alleys ran red with blood. Fires devoured entire districts, lighting the night sky in terrible orange. The great Zen gardens of the capital were trampled by soldiers' boots. Even the nobles fled, abandoning their ancestral estates to the flames. The people called it the burning of the capital, and in their whispers, they wondered if the gods had turned away from Japan. Through the smoke and chaos walked the samurai, men who once studied poetry now wielding their katanas without hesitation. The war had stripped away the thin layer of refinement that had covered the warrior's heart. What remained was raw survival and shifting loyalty. Families that had stood together for generations turned upon each other. Brothers fought brothers, fathers fought sons. The samurai's code of honor endured, but it grew harsher, colder, forged in desperation and fire. When the Unin War finally burned itself out in 1477, nothing remained of Kyoto's former splendor. The city lay in ruins, its shogunate broken, its emperor powerless. The Ashikaga shoguns still sat upon their thrones, but their rule was now little more than ceremonial. Japan, once a single realm held together by the sword and the brush, had splintered into 1,000 war-torn fragments. The country had entered an era the people would later call Sengoku Jidai, the age of the warring states. It was an age of endless struggle. Every province became its own world, ruled by a daimyo, a feudal lord who sought to expand his power through cunning, alliance, or conquest. Castles rose on mountaintops, surrounded by stone walls and deep moats. Armies marched beneath banners bearing their clan symbols. The crimson sunburst of the Takeda, the lotus crest of the Usuji, the triple hollyhock of the Tokugawa. Peasants tilled the same fields that soldiers fought upon, their lives bound to the rhythm of war. And yet, even in chaos, Japan found a strange kind of order. The samurai, tested in constant conflict, grew sharper, their strategy refined, their discipline absolute. Generals studied the art of war not merely as a matter of tactics, but as a philosophy. The teachings of Sun Tzu from ancient China merged with Zen reflection, giving rise to a uniquely Japanese way of warfare, one that saw no separation between the physical and the spiritual, between battle and meditation. To strike with clarity, one's mind had to be still. To command others, one had to first master oneself. But the Sengoku age was not just a story of destruction, it was a crucible of rebirth. The constant clash of armies spurred innovation. Firearms arrived from Portuguese traders in the mid-16th century, forever altering the nature of combat. Fortifications became grander, strategy more complex, alliances more fragile. Out of this endless storm would rise men of extraordinary ambition and vision. Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, names that would soon echo through history as the unifiers of Japan. For now, though, the land remained fractured. Smoke drifted from burning villages. The once holy city of Kyoto lay quiet, its temples scarred by flame, its bells silent. The samurai stood among the ruins, their armor blackened, their swords dull with use, and their eyes reflecting both sorrow and resolve. From the ashes of order, a new age had begun, one that would test the limits of loyalty, honor, and the human spirit itself. Out of the chaos of the Sengoku Jidai, when Japan had become a patchwork of warring clans and shifting allegiances, there emerged a man whose ambition burned brighter than the fires that consumed Kyoto. His name was Oda Nobunaga, the Fool of Owari, they called him once. a reckless, unpredictable lord from a minor province, dismissed by rivals as an erratic upstart. But behind his wild demeanor lay a mind like a blade, sharp, fearless, and utterly without hesitation. In a time when honor had grown twisted by ambition, Nobunaga would reshape the very meaning of power. He was born into a fractured world. Every mountain hid a castle. Every valley echoed with the clash of steel. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, as if Japan were holding its breath before an inevitable storm. In such a world, patience was weakness, and hesitation meant death. Nobunaga understood this better than any other. From a young age, he learned that war was not merely fought with swords, but with vision, that true dominance came not from lineage, but from the will to act when others faltered. When his father died, leaving him the Oda clan, his enemies expected his downfall. Nobunaga, unpredictable and brash, attended his father's funeral dressed not in mourning robes, but in rough clothing, tossing incense at the altar instead of bowing. The elders were horrified. They whispered that he was unfit to lead, that the Oda were doomed. But Nobunaga was not mad. He was deliberate. He had no patience for hollow ceremony, no faith in the fragile traditions that had led Japan into endless war. His eyes were already fixed on something far greater, the unification of the realm. He began by crushing his rivals within Owari. His first great victory came at the Battle of Okahazama in 1560, a moment that would change the balance of power forever. Facing the mighty Imagawa Yoshimoto, who led a force more than 10 times his size, Nobunaga seemed destined for annihilation. Yet, as a summer storm raged, he struck with the precision of lightning. His small force descended upon the enemy camp in a surprise assault, cutting down Yoshimoto himself amid chaos and thunder. When the storm cleared, the Imagawa army was shattered, and Japan had a new power to fear. Nobunaga's rise was not only built on warfare, but on innovation. He embraced the new technology of the Tanegashima, the matchlock firearm brought by Portuguese traders just years earlier. Where traditionalists scorned these foreign weapons as dishonorable, Nobunaga saw their potential. He drilled his soldiers in coordinated volleys, transforming the battlefield into a storm of smoke and fire. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he proved his genius beyond doubt. Against the fearsome cavalry of the Takeda clan, he positioned his gunners behind wooden barricades and unleashed a relentless barrage. The once invincible horsemen were annihilated, their charge broken by thunder and flame. It was not merely a victory, it was the birth of modern warfare in Japan. But Nobunaga's ambition went beyond conquest. He sought to break the old order, the tangled web of temples, clans, and corrupt traditions that had bound Japan for centuries. He waged war not only on rival lords, but on the very institutions that defied his authority. The great Enryakuji monastery on Mount High, whose warrior monks had long interfered in politics, stood against him, and he responded with fire. His army surrounded the mountain, set it ablaze, and slaughtered thousands. It was an act both brutal and symbolic, the old faith consumed by the flames of a new era. To his enemies, Nobunaga was a demon, ruthless, impious, and merciless. But to his followers, he was a visionary. He built cities where merchants thrived, invited foreign traders and missionaries, and encouraged the exchange of ideas and technology. His capital at Azuchi Castle was more than a fortress. It was a symbol of his vision, towering walls and golden halls reflecting his dream of a unified, powerful Japan. It stood beside Lake Biwa like a mirror of the heavens, declaring to all that the age of chaos was ending. Yet even as his star rose, shadows gathered around him. Ambition burns bright, but it also blinds. Nobunaga's fire would consume much, including himself. Betrayal would come from within, from a man he trusted most. But for now, the land trembled beneath his banner, the crimson crest of the Oda fluttering in the wind. Japan's destiny was changing, and the world watched as one man's will bent an entire nation toward unity. By the late 1580s, Oda Nobunaga had become more than a man. He was a storm. His armies had swept across Japan, his banners fluttering over provinces that had once been divided by centuries of feudal strife. Daimyo after daimyo had fallen before his relentless ambition. The emperor himself, long a powerless figurehead, now looked to Nobunaga as the true master of the realm. He had broken temples, humbled warlords, and bent the ancient traditions of Japan to his will. But power, as it always does, breeds both awe and fear. For those who stood beneath his shadow, Nobunaga's brilliance felt less like sunlight and more like fire. To his allies, he was both savior and tyrant. His temper was infamous. A single perceived slight could summon a wrath that burned like the battles he waged. He demanded perfection and loyalty beyond reason. Many feared him, yet could not look away from his blazing charisma. His dream of unifying Japan had become almost divine, a destiny no one dared question. But among the ranks of his vassals, the seeds of betrayal had already been sown. One man, in particular, would bring that dream crashing down in a single night of fire and betrayal. Akechi Mitsuhide. Mitsuhide was no ordinary retainer. A refined man, educated, loyal, and strategic, he had long served Nobunaga with distinction. Yet, somewhere between service and humiliation, admiration curdled into resentment. Nobunaga, brilliant but cruel, often mocked his subordinates, testing their loyalty as he tested their endurance. To a proud man like Mitsuhide, each insult was a blade turned inward. No one knows the exact moment his heart shifted, whether it was a harsh word, a denied favor, or the death of his mother at the hands of Nobunaga's soldiers. But the fire of betrayal began to smolder quietly, waiting for its moment to ignite. That moment came in June of 1582. Nobunaga, at the height of his power, had dispatched his armies to continue the conquest of western Japan under his most trusted general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Confident that victory was near, Nobunaga traveled to Kyoto, accompanied by only a small retinue. He lodged at the Honnoji Temple, a quiet refuge nestled amid the capital's wooden streets. The city was peaceful, the summer air heavy with humidity and the scent of burning incense. No one could have imagined that within hours, the heart of Japan's mightiest warlord would stop beating. At dawn, the stillness was shattered by the thunder of drums. The temple gates trembled beneath the boots of Akechi Mitsuhide's army, soldiers who had once sworn. With only a few dozen attendants, Nobunaga seized his bow, his blade flashing in the pale morning light. He fought as he had lived, fearlessly, without hesitation. His retainers fell one by one, the temple engulfed in flames as arrows rained down. The heat grew unbearable. The golden statues of the Buddha melted in the inferno. Surrounded and wounded, Nobunaga retreated deeper into the burning temple. He knew the samurai's code left him only one choice. Rather than be taken or defiled, he would die by his own hand, his final act of defiance. There, within the collapsing halls of Honnoji, the demon king of the sixth heaven performed seppuku, ritual suicide. His sword flashed one last time, his spirit departing in fire and smoke. As the temple crumbled, Kyoto's sky turned crimson. The flames devoured everything, as if the heavens themselves mourned and judged the man who had sought to conquer them. Mitsuhide's rebellion was short-lived. His forces, though momentarily victorious, lacked the strength to claim Nobunaga's empire. Within 13 days, Toyotomi Hideyoshi avenged his fallen master at the Battle of Yamazaki, crushing the traitor's army and ending his brief rule. Mitsuhide himself was hunted down and killed while fleeing, struck down by peasants who looted his corpse for scraps of armor. Thus, the man who destroyed the mightiest warlord in Japan met an ignoble end, forgotten by history, while Nobunaga's legend only grew brighter in death. Yet, Nobunaga's fall was not the end, it was the turning of the wheel. His vision did not die in the fire. Two men would carry his legacy forward. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant who would rise to become Japan's ruler, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would one day build the peace Nobunaga could only dream of. The Demon King's fire had scorched the land, but from its ashes, Japan would finally find order. The age of chaos was ending, and a new dawn awaited, born from betrayal, blood, and the burning temple of Honnoji. When the flames of Honnoji faded and the smoke drifted across the morning sky, Japan was once again plunged into uncertainty. The great Oda Nobunaga, the man who had dared to bend the heavens to his will, was gone. Yet, from those ashes, destiny turned its gaze toward a most unlikely figure. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man born not of noble blood nor ancient clan, but of humble peasant roots. Where others inherited power, Hideyoshi earned it, through wit, audacity, and a charisma that could bend warriors to his cause. His rise would become one of the most astonishing stories in all of Japanese history. The ascension of a man who began with nothing, yet reached for everything. Hideyoshi had served Nobunaga faithfully for decades, starting as a lowly sandal-bearer, the one who warmed his lord's footwear before battle. But beneath his unassuming demeanor lay a mind of startling brilliance. He could read people like others read battle maps, sensing ambition, weakness, and loyalty with uncanny precision. In the chaotic years of Nobunaga's conquests, Hideyoshi proved himself again and again, not only as a strategist, but as a builder of alliances and a master of persuasion. Nobunaga, who respected talent more than lineage, elevated him, entrusting him with ever greater campaigns. To many, Hideyoshi became the embodiment of Nobunaga's own vision, a world where merit, not birth, defined power. When news of Nobunaga's death reached him, Hideyoshi was leading an army deep in the western provinces. The betrayal at Honnoji struck like a thunderclap, but unlike others who hesitated, Hideyoshi acted instantly. He understood that hesitation meant ruin. Feigning peace with the enemy he was fighting, he negotiated a temporary truce, then forced his army to march at impossible speed back toward Kyoto, covering a distance that should have taken weeks in mere days. His men trudged through rain and mud, driven by a commander who seemed possessed by the ghost of his fallen lord. When they arrived, breathless and exhausted, Hideyoshi unleashed his vengeance upon Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, crushing the traitor in a single decisive strike. The avenger of Nobunaga had been chosen, and Japan knew his name. Yet victory was only the beginning. With Nobunaga gone, his vast territories fractured into rival claims, each of his former generals vying for supremacy. Hideyoshi, however, played the game differently. Where others reached for the sword, he reached for the heart. He offered forgiveness to some, alliances to others, and marriage ties to many. He built a network not through bloodshed alone, but through cunning diplomacy. In a nation that had known nothing but war for generations, his combination of ruthlessness and empathy felt almost divine. Slowly, province by province, clan by clan, he drew Japan back under one banner, his own. But Hideyoshi's genius extended beyond the battlefield. He understood that conquest alone could not sustain a nation. He sought to govern what he had united. He began reforms that restructured Japan's feudal order, confiscating weapons from peasants, creating a rigid social hierarchy, and instituting land surveys that measured every grain of rice produced in his realm. For the first time in centuries, Japan knew relative peace, a fragile calm held together not by fear, but by order. He commissioned grand castles like Osaka Castle, vast fortresses that gleamed like symbols of his new age. Merchants thrived, cities grew, and art blossomed. The tea ceremony, once a noble pastime, became a spiritual ritual reflecting the harmony Hideyoshi sought to impose upon the land. Yet, even as he built monuments of stone, Hideyoshi's ambitions turned outward, toward the sea and beyond. He began to dream of conquering China, of expanding Japan's dominion beyond its shores. The same fire that had driven Nobunaga's conquests burned now within his peasant-born successor. He saw himself as more than a ruler, as a living embodiment of destiny, chosen to reshape the world. But fate, ever cruel, would remind him that even the greatest climb must one day meet the summit. His later years would be marked by obsession, by failed invasions, and by the slow unraveling of all he had built. Still, in those shining decades of unity, Japan had found something precious: peace after centuries of chaos. Hideyoshi, the commoner who rose higher than any samurai before him, had done what even the Demon King could not. He gave Japan time to breathe. His name would echo through the centuries, not just as a warrior or a ruler, but as a symbol of how far the human spirit can climb when guided by vision, cunning, and unbreakable will. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi's final days approached, Japan stood upon the edge of transformation once again. His dream of unity, so carefully forged through decades of struggle, rested upon fragile foundations, alliances built upon loyalty to him alone. As his strength waned, so too did the threads that bound the realm together. His infant son, Hideyori, was named heir, but the lords who bowed to Hideyoshi's will whispered among themselves, their loyalty shifting like the tides. It was in this uncertain dawn that another figure, quiet yet watchful, began to rise from the shadows of history: Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man whose patience and foresight would shape the next 250 years of Japan's destiny. Ieyasu had long been a survivor in an age that devoured ambition. Born into a minor clan of the eastern provinces, he was taken hostage as a child, traded between rival lords like a pawn in the endless wars of the Sengoku era. Yet through those years of captivity and service, he learned the art of endurance, of bending without breaking. He served under Nobunaga, fought alongside Hideyoshi, and bided his time with a calm that others mistook for timidity. But behind his composed exterior lay the heart of a strategist who understood that true power did not always announce itself with noise or violence. Sometimes it waited, like a coiled serpent, for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came in the wake of Hideyoshi's death. With the Toyotomi heir still a child, a council of regents was established to rule Japan until his maturity. Ieyasu was among them, but his presence was more than symbolic. The other lords distrusted him, sensing the quiet gravity of his ambition. And they were right too. Ieyasu began consolidating his control in the east, gathering allies among powerful daimyo who longed for stability after generations of chaos. His base in Edo, modern Tokyo, became not just a military stronghold, but a city of order and discipline, the embryo of a new political world. Tensions between East and West simmered beneath the surface. In 1600, those tensions erupted into open conflict, the Battle of Sekigahara, a confrontation that would decide the fate of Japan. The forces loyal to the Toyotomi and Western lords clashed with Ieyasu's Eastern coalition in a storm of banners, steel, and smoke. For hours, the plains of Sekigahara were shrouded in fog and death, until betrayal, that ever-present shadow in Japanese history, turned the tide. Several Western commanders switched sides mid-battle, sealing the Toyotomi's doom. When the mist cleared, the field was littered with corpses, and the age of uncertainty was over. Ieyasu had triumphed. The samurai world, weary from centuries of blood, had found its new master. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was granted the title Sei Taishogun, Great Barbarian Subduing Generalissimo, by the emperor. It was a title of immense prestige, but Ieyasu understood that symbols were only the beginning. He set about crafting a system that would ensure not only his rule but the endurance of peace for generations. From his capital in Edo, he constructed the framework of the Tokugawa shogunate, a government rooted in hierarchy, discipline, and surveillance. The daimyo were required to maintain loyalty by sending their families as hostages to Edo, a policy known as Sankenkotai, alternate attendance. This brilliant system kept the lords in check, draining their wealth and preventing rebellion, while simultaneously enriching Edo through constant movement of people and goods. Under Tokugawa rule, Japan transformed. Roads were built, cities flourished, and the arts found patronage as never before. Kabuki theater, woodblock prints, and haiku poetry blossomed, reflecting a society at peace with itself, outwardly serene, yet still governed by the quiet tension of obedience and control. Samurai, once defined by warfare, became bureaucrats, administrators, and moral exemplars. Their swords, now rarely drawn, became symbols of status rather than instruments of war. The Bushido ethic evolved into a code of conduct, loyalty, restraint, and mastery over self, guiding not just warriors but the very spirit of Japanese identity. And yet, beneath this harmony, shadows lingered. The Tokugawa peace came at a price: isolation. Foreign influence was tightly restricted. Christianity was outlawed. Japan sealed its borders to the outside world. The shogunate believed that in controlling knowledge, they could preserve purity. For 2.5 centuries, this equilibrium held, a delicate balance of order and fear. The world beyond Japan's shores would move forward, empires rising and falling, while the islands slumbered in their golden cage. But for the weary land, after ages of chaos, perhaps peace, even a constrained one, was enough. Tokugawa Ieyasu had achieved what countless warlords before him could not. He turned conquest into governance, and ambition into legacy. His dynasty would endure unbroken until the very dawn of the modern age, its foundations laid not in fire and blood, but in the stillness of perfect control. The thunder of war drums had faded, replaced by the soft rhythm of life. The land that had once burned beneath the ambitions of countless daimyo now exhaled, slowly, carefully, into the long calm of the Edo period. Where once armies had marched and villages trembled, rice paddies shimmered in the morning mist, tended by farmers who finally knew the meaning of peace. From the great castles of Osaka and Himeji to the quiet fishing villages along the coasts, Japan entered an age unlike any before it. 2.5 centuries of relative stillness, discipline, and introspection. This was the world that Tokugawa Ieyasu and his heirs built, a fortress of order, bound by loyalty and ritual, sealed against the chaos beyond the seas. In Edo, the new capital, life moved with clockwork precision. The city itself was a marvel, a sprawling labyrinth of moats, bridges, and wooden streets, divided by class yet unified by rhythm. Samurai walked its avenues in crisp robes, their swords gleaming yet rarely unsheathed. Merchants displayed fine silks and lacquered wares along Nyanbashi, their stalls humming with conversation. Priests rang temple bells at dawn. Poets gathered under lanterns to compose verses about cherry blossoms, fleeting beauty, and the impermanence of all things. The smell of incense, grilled fish, and fresh rain hung in the air, blending with the chatter of townsfolk and the distant sound of waves against the shore. Edo was not merely a city. It was the beating heart of a carefully balanced empire. The Tokugawa shogunate governed through a system of strict hierarchy and moral philosophy. At its apex stood the shogun, whose word was law, yet even his power was restrained by ritual and bureaucracy. Below him, the daimyo ruled their provinces under the watchful eye of Edo, required to alternate residence between their domains and the capital. Their families, kept in Edo as honored hostages, ensured obedience. Samurai served as administrators and enforcers. Below the samurai stood the peasants, artisans, and merchants, the four-tiered social order known as Shirnokyosho. Farmers were valued for feeding the nation, artisans for their craftsmanship, and merchants, though often the wealthiest, were regarded as morally suspect for profiting from others' labor. Yet, paradoxically, as peace deepened, it was the merchants who quietly flourished. Trade within Japan blossomed, towns expanded, and a new urban culture began to emerge, vibrant and indulgent. Kabuki theaters drew crowds with their bold actors and glittering costumes. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, pictures of the floating world, captured moments of fleeting pleasure. Courtesans, sumo wrestlers, festivals, and moonlit rivers. While the samurai preached austerity, the people embraced beauty. Religion and philosophy also intertwined in daily life. Shinto, the ancient native faith, remained the spiritual backbone of the people, with its reverence for nature and purity. Buddhism, particularly Zen, shaped the minds of the elite, emphasizing simplicity and impermanence. Together, they wove a tapestry of thought that guided even the smallest gestures. The tea ceremony, for instance, was not a simple act of hospitality but a quiet dialogue between souls, a ritual of harmony, respect, and mindfulness. In this still world, meaning was found not in conquest but in perfection of form. Yet, beneath the calm surface, cracks began to form. For the samurai, peace brought purpose, but also stagnation. Their stipends dwindled as inflation rose. Their swords became symbols of status rather than tools of survival. Some turned to philosophy, others to poetry, and a few, unable to adapt, fell into despair. The very virtues that had defined them, loyalty, sacrifice, self-control, began to feel like relics of another age. The Tokugawa system, for all its brilliance, was a cage, beautiful, serene, and slowly suffocating. Meanwhile, beyond Japan's borders, the world was changing. Empires expanded across oceans. New technologies reshaped warfare and commerce. Western powers, once distant rumors, now prowled the Pacific, their sails bright against the horizon. The shogunate's isolationist policy, sakoku, forbade most foreign contact. Only a handful of Dutch traders were permitted to dock at Nagasaki, confined to a tiny artificial island called Dejima. Through them, fragments of foreign knowledge trickled in: telescopes, anatomy books, maps of stars. Scholars, forbidden yet curious, began studying these rengaku, or Dutch learning, planting the earliest seeds of Japan's awakening. But for the common people, life remained slow, cyclical, and poetic. The seasons marked their world: spring blossoms, summer festivals, autumn harvests, winter snow. They sang folk songs of love and impermanence, prayed at shrines for bountiful rice, and watched their children chase fireflies at dusk. For all its rigidity, the Edo peace offered something precious: time. Time to build, to create, to reflect. In that long stillness, Japan did not conquer the world, it discovered itself. The Edo period was not a golden age free from suffering, but a delicate balance between discipline and desire, stillness and motion. It was a world poised between two breaths, one that remembered the chaos of its birth and sensed the storm of its ending. For now, though, the land of the samurai slept, sword by its side, mind at rest, beneath a sky of 1,000 silent stars. In the hush of dawn, before the first light touched the paper walls of a samurai's home, there was silence, a silence filled not with emptiness, but with purpose. The faint crackle of a candle, the whisper of a brush on parchment, the slow, steady breath of meditation. To live as a samurai was not merely to fight, it was to be. Every movement, every thought, every heartbeat was guided by a code older than memory itself. It was called Bushido, the way of the warrior. Yet it was not a single rule or doctrine, but a philosophy that grew, like bamboo, flexible yet unyielding, rooted in loyalty, shaped by honor, and tempered by death. Bushido was more than courage in battle. It was a way of living with grace under the shadow of impermanence. A samurai was taught that death was always near, not as fear, but as truth. To embrace death was to free oneself from hesitation. When faced with two choices, wrote Yamamoto Tsunetomo in Hagakure, choose the one that leads to death. In this paradox lay strength. By accepting mortality, the samurai gained clarity. They did not fight to survive, but to serve. The sword was an extension of the soul, sharp, disciplined, and honest. To draw it unjustly was to stain one's spirit. To die with it honorably was to be reborn in memory. The virtues of Bushido, Gi, righteousness, Yu, courage, Jin, benevolence, Rei, respect, Makoto, honesty, Meo, honor, and Chugi, loyalty, were the pillars of this invisible fortress. Together they formed a path that demanded balance between ferocity and compassion. A samurai was expected to strike down his enemy with precision, yet bow with humility before a priest or poet. To dishonor oneself was worse than defeat. And so, when shame could not be erased by deeds, the the samurai turned to the ritual of seppuku, self-disembowelment, a final act of control and integrity. The blade that had once defended life became the instrument of redemption. Pain was not the punishment, but the purification. Yet Bushido was never static. It evolved with the times, from battlefield necessity to moral compass, from code to culture. In the Edo peace, where swords grew idle, Bushido turned inward. The warrior became a scholar, a statesman, a philosopher. Martial arts were practiced not to kill, but to perfect the spirit. The tea ceremony became a meditation on stillness, calligraphy, and exercise in focus. The way of the sword merged with the way of the brush. The pen and the sword in accord, the saying went, a truth the samurai held sacred. Through this, they found meaning beyond war. Zen Buddhism shaped much of this introspection. The teachings of impermanence, mindfulness, and detachment resonated deeply with the samurai soul. In meditation, one learned to still the chaos within. In the garden, to find order in simplicity. In combat, to act without hesitation. The perfect strike, like enlightenment, came not from thought but from emptiness, from a mind as calm as a still pond. In that instant between motion and stillness, the samurai and the universe became one. The sword, polished until it reflected the morning light, was not a weapon, it was a mirror of the self. Still, Bushido was no utopia of virtue. It was a double-edged coat. The same loyalty that bound a samurai to his lord could blind him to justice. The same honor that uplifted could destroy. Countless warriors died not for righteousness, but for pride, not for justice, but for obedience. The ideal of Bushido demanded perfection from beings made of imperfection. And yet, it was this striving, this endless pursuit of purity in an imperfect world, that gave it beauty. Like the cherry blossom, the samurai's life was short, but its fall was graceful. In time, Bushido left the battlefield and entered the soul of a nation. It influenced art, politics, and philosophy, shaping how Japan saw courage, duty, and self-restraint. Even in later centuries, when guns replaced swords and emperors reclaimed power, the ghost of Bushido lingered in the hearts of the people. It lived in the quiet bow of a craftsman, the patience of a calligrapher, the resolve of a soldier. It whispered that true strength was not found in victory, but in virtue. As the candle burned lower in that quiet samurai home, the warrior bowed his head and breathed the same vow that his ancestors had whispered for generations: to serve with honor, to die without fear, to live with purpose. The wind outside stirred the paper walls, carrying the scent of pine and ink. The sword beside him gleamed faintly, silent, patient, eternal. Bushido was not a law written by men. It was a light carried through darkness, a way of living that, even in peace, remembered the beauty of dying well. Long before the samurai ruled Japan, the land was divided not by borders, but by loyalties. The emperor's court in Kyoto gleamed with silk and poetry, but far from the capital, across mist-shrouded mountains and river valleys, another power was rising. Provincial families, once humble enforcers and guards of aristocratic estates, had grown strong through war and hardship. They learned to live by the sword, to command men and horses, and to carve their own destiny. Among them, two names would soon echo through the centuries: Minamoto and Taira, clans born of imperial blood, yet bound to battle each other in a struggle that would shape Japan's soul. The story began in the twilight of the Heian era. The court nobles, once supreme, had become delicate, more concerned with verse and fragrance than valor. The countryside, meanwhile, seethed with rebellion and banditry. The emperor's soldiers could not enforce order beyond the city walls, and so he called upon the Bushi, the men of war. From distant provinces, armored riders came to serve the throne. They were fierce, loyal, and disciplined, owing allegiance not to the court's elegance but to their lord's strength. In this crucible of duty and chaos, the samurai began to take shape, not as servants, but as rulers in waiting. The Taira clan, descended from Emperor Kamu, were the first to master the art of power. Led by Taira no Kayamori, they rose from provincial obscurity to dominate the imperial court itself. Kayamori was not just a warrior. He was a statesman, a strategist, a man who understood that swords alone could not rule a nation, but fear and respect could. Under his rule, the Taira gained immense wealth from maritime trade and used it to build alliances through marriage, weaving themselves into the heart of Kyoto's politics. For the first time, a warrior clan stood above the courtiers. The age of the aristocracy was ending. The age of the samurai had begun. But in every rise lies the seed of downfall. Watching from the shadows was the Minamoto clan, equally noble, equally ambitious, and eternally resentful. Once exiled and crushed by Taira power, they waited, biding their time in the cold northern provinces, gathering followers and sharpening their blades. Their chance came in 1180, when Prince Machihito, a rival to the throne, called upon the Minamoto to overthrow the Taira's tyranny. His rebellion was swiftly crushed, but it lit a fire that no flood could quench. The country plunged into civil war, the Genpei War, a conflict that would rage for 5 years, turning rivers red and fields to ash. The battles were not fought for land alone, but for legitimacy. Samurai fought not merely as soldiers, but as believers in destiny. Families split, brothers fought brothers, and the loyalty of retainers was tested by blood and betrayal. Across the narrow valleys and misty coasts, banners bearing the red of the Taira and the white of the Minamoto clashed like storm clouds. Epic duels were fought on horseback, with warriors announcing their names before combat, seeking eternal glory even in death. In these moments, the ideals of Bushido were forged in fire, the poetry of courage written in steel and sacrifice. The war's climax came at the Battle of Danoyura in 1185. On the narrow waters of the Shimonoseki Strait, the Taira fleet faced the Minamoto in a desperate final stand. The sea foamed with arrows and shattered masts. The cries of men and the crash of waves merged into a single, terrible hymn. As defeat became certain, Taira no Tamamori tied an anchor to his feet and plunged into the depths. Beside him, the child emperor Entoku, barely 6 years old, was carried into the sea by his grandmother. The capital of the sea, they said, welcomes her emperor. The Taira were no more. From the ruins rose Minamoto no Yoritamo, the man who would found the Kamakura shogunate, Japan's first military government. The emperor still sat upon the throne, but real power now flowed through the hands of the shogun. It was a quiet revolution. The court still shimmered in Kyoto, but its words meant nothing beyond its walls. The sword, not the scroll, ruled Japan. And though the Minamoto's triumph seemed absolute, it marked not the end of conflict, but the beginning of a cycle: rise and fall, honor and betrayal, peace and war. Such was the rhythm of the samurai's world. In the stillness after battle, the waves lapped gently against the shore where the Taira had fallen. Fishermen claimed that, even centuries later, strange crabs bore faces on their shells, the spirits of those warriors, immortalized by the sea. The story of the Minamoto and Taira was no longer mere history. It had become legend, etched into Japan's collective soul. From their ashes, a new order was born, an empire of warriors whose discipline and pride would define the next 700 years. When the final echoes of battle faded from the shores of Danoyura, Japan stood upon the threshold of a new age. The emperor's authority still shimmered in the rituals of Kyoto, but the true heart of power had shifted far to the east, to the quiet coastal city of Kamakura, where Minamoto no Yoritamo began to weave the threads of a new order. It was here, among the pine forests and sea winds, that the samurai's rule truly began. For the first time in Japanese history, the sword, not divine birth, would determine who governed the land. Yoritamo was no mere conqueror. He was a statesman cloaked in armor, a man who understood that victory on the battlefield meant little without the machinery of control. From the ashes of war, he built a government unlike anything Japan had seen before, a military government, or bakufu, ruled by the shogun. The emperor remained the symbolic sovereign, the sacred son of tradition, but in Kamakura, the shogun held the reins of real authority. It was a delicate balance, reverence without obedience, ceremony without power. And yet, it worked, for the samurai valued structure as much as steel. To maintain control over a fractured nation, Yoritomo crafted a system grounded in loyalty and order. The Gokunin, his vassals, swore fealty to him directly, pledging their lives, lands, and swords in exchange for protection and privilege. In return, he rewarded them not with distant promises, but with tangible lands and authority. Every province, every estate was bound to this chain of allegiance, each warrior tied by both duty and gratitude. Thus, the samurai hierarchy was born, a web of mutual obligation that would sustain centuries of feudal rule. Yet power, once seized, is never secure. The very system that gave Yoritomo strength also bred ambition among those who served him. Rival generals, jealous courtiers, and even his own family tested his will. The Hojo clan, bound to him by marriage, watched closely, waiting for the moment the tide would turn. But Yoritomo ruled with an iron sense of purpose. He saw the need to separate the sword from the scroll, to ensure that military might never again bow completely to imperial whim. He built a bureaucracy of warriors, establishing offices for judicial affairs, policing, and land administration, all designed to sustain the Bakufu's independence from Kyoto's elegant decay. Under his rule, Japan found a fragile kind of peace. Roads once haunted by bandits grew safe again. Peasants could till their fields without fear of armies trampling their crops. Buddhist temples flourished under samurai patronage, spreading not only religion but a sense of moral order. Monks and warriors found a strange harmony between sword and spirit, a belief that enlightenment could be pursued not just in meditation, but in the discipline of one's duty. Out of this union of steel and soul, the earliest whispers of Bushido began to emerge, a way of life where courage, loyalty, and honor were held above all else. Still, the peace of Kamakura was not the peace of the heart. Yoritomo's rule was shadowed by suspicion. He distrusted even his kin, fearing betrayal where there might have been loyalty. In 1199, when he fell from his horse and died, the empire he had forged trembled. The power vacuum was filled not by another Minamoto, but by the shrewd and calculating Hojo clan, who ruled as regents under the shogun's name. Their governance was subtle yet absolute, an invisible hand guiding the sword. Under the Hojo regency, the Bakufu solidified. They formalized laws, resolved disputes, and balanced power between Kyoto's court and Kamakura's military. For the first time, Japan became a nation governed by legal precedent rather than the whims of nobility. The Gozaibai Shikamoku, or Formulary of Adjudications, became the samurai's legal code, a testament to the transformation from chaos to structure. The Hojo, though unelected and often ruthless, preserved what Yoritomo had built. Their quiet strength kept Japan stable for more than a century. But no peace endures forever. Beyond the calm shores of Kamakura, storms gathered. Across the sea, in distant Mongolia, a vast empire was rising under Kublai Khan, hungering for new lands to conquer. When his emissaries arrived in Japan demanding submission, the shogunate refused. Twice, the Mongol fleets came, great armadas of warriors and ships darkening the horizon. And twice, Japan was saved not by human power, but by the wind itself. The kamikaze, the divine wind, swept across the seas, destroying the invaders and searing the legend of divine protection into the Japanese soul. Yet victory came at a price. The cost of defending the realm drained the samurai's coffers, and with no new lands to claim, many warriors fell into debt and discontent. Beneath the calm surface of Kamakura's order, cracks began to form. Cracks that would, in time, shatter the world the Minamoto had built. But for now, in the hush of temple bells and the rhythm of waves against the shore, the spirit of the first shogunate endured, a symbol of discipline, unity, and the quiet strength of those who chose duty over glory. In the late 13th century, the world trembled beneath the hooves of the Mongol Empire. From the frozen steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Persia, from the rivers of China to the plains of Hungary, no kingdom seemed beyond its grasp. And in the far reaches of the Pacific, where the sun rose over an island kingdom of warriors and poets, the gaze of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, turned eastward, to Japan. To the Mongols, Japan was but another land to be folded into their dominion. But to the samurai, it was sacred soil, protected by ancestors, gods, and the spirits of the wind and sea. What followed would become one of the most legendary moments in Japanese history, the invasion that defied an empire. In 1274, after years of failed diplomacy, the first Mongol armada set sail from the Korean peninsula. It was a sight unseen in Japanese waters. Hundreds of ships packed with Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers, archers, cavalrymen, and siege engineers, bearing the thunder of a world united under one banner. They landed on the shores of Tsushima and Iki Island, slaughtering defenders before pressing onward to Hakata Bay in Kyushu. The samurai, accustomed to duels and individual combat, now faced a new kind of warfare: organized ranks, explosive weapons, and relentless volleys of arrows. The Mongols fought as a machine, each soldier a gear in the wheel of destruction. But the samurai were not easily broken. Clad in lacquered armor, banners fluttering behind them, they fought with a ferocity born of honor. They challenged the invaders in single combat, cutting through lines of soldiers in desperate acts of valor. Yet, their bravery could not halt the Mongol tide. The Japanese lines wavered, and Hakata's defenses began to crumble. But as night fell and the Mongols prepared to press their advantage, nature itself turned against them. A fierce storm swept across the bay, capsizing ships and scattering the invaders. The survivors retreated under the cover of chaos. Their first invasion ended not by sword, but by wind. The reprieve was temporary. In the years that followed, Japan fortified its coasts. Massive stone walls rose along Hakata Bay, stretching for miles, a testament to both fear and determination. Monks prayed for divine protection, while the shogunate prepared for the inevitable return of the enemy. And return they did. In 1281, Kublai Khan launched his second and mightiest invasion. Two fleets, one from Korea and one from southern China, converged on Japan. More than 140,000 soldiers and 4,000 ships, the largest armada the world had yet seen. Their goal: to crush Japan completely. For weeks, the skies over Hakata were black with the sails of the Mongols. But the samurai were ready. They harassed the invaders with daring night raids, boarding enemy ships and cutting down crews in close combat. Fires blazed across the sea, the clash of steel echoing through the summer air. Still, the sheer numbers of the Mongols seemed overwhelming. The samurai's courage burned bright, but even the brightest flame can be smothered by the storm. And then, as if summoned by the prayers of millions, the storm came again. A typhoon, vast and merciless, tore across Kyushu. The wind howled like 1,000 spirits unleashed. Waves rose like mountains, smashing wooden hulls to splinters. Men screamed, ships shattered, and the sea swallowed the might of the Mongol Empire whole. For 2 days and nights, the tempest raged. When dawn finally broke, the waters were choked with debris, broken masts, armor, and the lifeless bodies of soldiers who had never set foot on Japanese soil. Out of the devastation, the survivors whispered a word that would echo through history: kamikaze, the divine wind. To the Japanese, this was no mere storm. It was a sign, a message from the heavens that the gods themselves had chosen to protect their land. Temples and shrines were built to honor the spirits of the wind, and the tale of divine salvation spread through every province. The samurai, though exhausted and bloodied, emerged not just as warriors but as instruments of destiny. Their courage had been tested by the greatest empire the world had known, and they had prevailed. Yet, victory brought little peace. The shogunate had spent vast fortunes preparing for the invasions, but the lack of spoils left many samurai unrewarded. Resentment simmered in the ranks, debts grew heavy, and faith in Kamakura's leadership began to waver. The Mongol threat had united Japan for a time, but in its aftermath, the seeds of discontent were sown. The divine wind had saved the nation, but it could not protect the shogunate from the storms yet to come, storms not of nature, but of ambition, betrayal, and the changing tides of history. Still, in the quiet years that followed, the people of Japan remembered. They remembered the thunder of the Mongol drums, the crash of the waves, the unyielding courage of the samurai, and the whisper of the divine wind that had shielded their islands. The legend of the kamikaze became a cornerstone of national identity, a belief that Japan, the land of the gods, would always be protected by forces greater than any mortal power. After the divine winds drove back the Mongol fleets, Japan stood proud but weary. The seas were calm again, the fields once more green with rice, and temples echoed with prayers of gratitude to the gods who had saved the islands. But beneath this surface of serenity, cracks began to form in the foundation of the Kamakura shogunate, cracks that no divine wind could mend. The warriors who had fought so bravely expected rewards, lands, and recognition for their service. Yet there were no conquered territories to divide, no treasures seized from fallen enemies. The war had been fought not for conquest, but for survival. And survival brought glory, but not wealth. The Hojo clan, who ruled as regents for the shoguns, found themselves beset by discontent. Their power had once been built upon efficiency and loyalty, but now their authority began to sour into arrogance and fear. The samurai, men bound by the code of honor and accustomed to reward, grew restless. Letters of complaint arrived at Kamakura from across the provinces, but the Hojo offered little more than empty words and stern decrees. What had once been a united warrior class began to splinter, each man questioning the worth of serving masters who ruled from afar yet gave nothing in return. The great victory over the Mongols had, in a cruel twist of fate, weakened the very government it had protected. As resentment spread, so too did ambition. Across the land, powerful families began to consolidate their strength. In Kyoto, the imperial court watched and waited. The emperor, long a figurehead under the shadow of the shogunate, began to dream once again of true power. One such dreamer was Emperor Go-Daigo, a man of sharp intellect and burning will. He was no passive sovereign content to live as a puppet. He sought to restore imperial rule, to cast off the military government and return Japan to the old ways, when the throne and the divine will were one. Go-Daigo's ambition found allies among the disaffected. Samurai, men who had bled for the shogunate, but received only debt and dishonor, began to rally behind him. His call for restoration was not just political, it was spiritual. He spoke of destiny, of the emperor's sacred right to rule, of a Japan united once more under the sun goddess Amaterasu's divine descendants. It was a message that stirred hearts across the provinces. Yet in Kamakura, the Hojo saw only rebellion, and they prepared to crush it. In 1331, the storm broke. Go-Daigo's plans were discovered, and he was captured, exiled to a distant island. His supporters were executed or scattered. But like all legends of Japan, his story did not end in defeat. Within 2 years, he escaped exile and reignited the flames of war. Samurai rose across the land in his name, including one whose destiny would forever change the course of Japanese history, Ashikaga Takauji. At first, Takauji fought for the shogunate, a loyal general of the Hojo. But as he witnessed the corruption of Kamakura's rulers, something shifted within him. The code of loyalty to one's lord clashed with the greater loyalty to justice and the emperor. And so, in a moment that shocked the nation, Takauji turned his army against Kamakura. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Armies marched under banners of gold and red, the cries of battle echoing through forests and plains. Kamakura, once the unshakable center of power, now faced betrayal from within and assault from without. The Hojo forces fought with desperate courage, but their cause was doomed. In 1333, after months of siege, the city fell. The regency that had ruled Japan for more than a century was obliterated in a torrent of fire and blood. The last Hojo leaders, seeing no escape, committed seppuku in the flaming ruins of their stronghold. Their deaths marked the end of an era. The Kamakura shogunate was no more. Emperor Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto in triumph, greeted as a living god. For the first time in over 100 years, Japan was once again Japan to the ancient model of divine kingship, where warriors served the throne without question. But the samurai, hardened by centuries of battle, no longer bowed easily. They had become Japan's true backbone, landholders, governors, and defenders of order. Takauji, recognizing the shifting tides, defied Go-Daigo and marched on Kyoto. What began as a political disagreement erupted into a civil war that split the realm in two. By 1336, Takauji's forces seized Kyoto, driving Go-Daigo south to Yoshino, where he established a rival court. Thus began the era of the northern and southern courts, a time when two emperors ruled simultaneously, each claiming legitimacy, and Japan itself was divided by sword and faith. The Ashikaga clan established their shogunate in Kyoto, marking the start of a new order, one less absolute than the Kamakura regime, but no less complex. Power was decentralized. Authority was shared between shogun and regional lords, a fragile dance of allegiance and ambition that would define the centuries to come. Under Ashikaga rule, Japan entered a paradoxical age, a time of both turmoil and cultural brilliance. While rival clans schemed and provinces rebelled, Kyoto blossomed into a haven of art, philosophy, and refinement. The Ashikaga shoguns, especially Yoshimitsu, cultivated beauty as both a weapon and a legacy. He transformed Kyoto into a city of splendor, commissioning temples, gardens, and the golden pavilion, Kinkikuji, whose gilded reflection shimmered over still waters like a dream of peace in an age of unrest. From the quiet courtyards of Zen monasteries rose a new aesthetic philosophy, wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection and impermanence. The samurai, once defined solely by warfare, now found themselves students of art, tea, and poetry. In the training halls of Zen temples, warriors learned not only how to strike with precision, but how to still the mind. The tea ceremony, born from Chinese influence and refined under Japanese discipline. In brutality, poets and killers, guardians and destroyers of their own world. The Ashikaga era was one of contradictions, art born from suffering, refinement forged from conflict, beauty intertwined with impermanence. It was a time when Japan learned that strength alone could not bring peace, and that even in the midst of war, the soul could still seek serenity in the stillness of a raked garden or the quiet sip of tea. From these centuries of division would rise men whose ambitions would reshape Japan forever. Men like Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. The age of endless war would one day end, but its lessons, written in the ink of sacrifice and the silence of fallen warriors, would define Japan's heart for eternity. The Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, was a century where Japan seemed caught between nightmare and rebirth. It was a time when the authority of the shogunate had crumbled into dust, and the islands fractured into 1,000 burning fragments, each ruled by a lord who bowed to no one but ambition. The emperor remained in Kyoto, but his word carried no weight beyond the palace walls. The Ashikaga shoguns lingered in name only, their banners tattered, their power hollow. Across mountains and plains, the great samurai clans turned upon one another, their castles rising like jagged teeth above the mist. It was an age of fire, steel, and endless shifting loyalties, a Japan where peace was but a rumor. In this maelstrom, 3 men would rise, each born into chaos, each driven by a vision that transcended blood and ashes. Their names, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, would echo through the centuries as the architects of a new Japan. But before their destinies intertwined, the land was a vast board of warlords, each seeking to carve their own empire from the wreckage of the old world. The first to rise above the storm was Oda Nobunaga, a daimyo from the province of Owari. In his youth, many had called him the Fool of Owari for his eccentric manners and disregard for tradition. But behind his strange behavior lay a mind of unparalleled brilliance, a strategist, a visionary, and a man utterly without fear. Nobunaga saw the truth of his age. The old codes of honor and lineage meant nothing without strength. In battle, he was ruthless and modern, embracing new technologies like firearms and Western tactics introduced by Portuguese traders. At the Battle of Okahazama, 1560, he defeated the powerful Imagawa clan with a force 1/10 their size, striking like lightning amid a thunderstorm. Japan took notice. Nobunaga's ambition burned hotter than any before him. He dreamt not of ruling a province, but of uniting an entire nation. He crushed rivals one by one. The Saito, the Asakura, the Azai, the Takeda, his armies sweeping across the land like a divine wind. He tore down Buddhist fortresses that had become corrupt centers of military power, burning the mighty Enrikaji temple on Mount High to the ground. He was feared, hated, admired, and obeyed. Nobunaga was a storm, unpredictable, unstoppable, and utterly committed to breaking the cycle of chaos that had consumed Japan for over a century. Yet, where Nobunaga was fire, his successor was water. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, born the son of a peasant foot soldier, rose from nothing to become the second unifier of Japan. He began as Nobunaga's servant, mocked by samurai for his humble birth, but his brilliance in diplomacy, logistics, and human understanding elevated him to the rank of general. When Nobunaga was betrayed and forced to die at Honnoji in 1582, it was Hideyoshi who avenged him, defeating his assassins and seizing control of the Oda legacy. Under Hideyoshi's leadership, the dream of unity became reality. He completed what Nobunaga began, bringing most of Japan under one rule through a mixture of warfare, diplomacy, and reform. He reorganized society, codified the samurai class, and forbade peasants from carrying weapons, cementing the social order that would define the next 250 years. Hideyoshi also embarked on grand ambitions beyond Japan's shores, launching invasions of Korea in the 1590s that, though ultimately unsuccessful, revealed the magnitude of his vision. But time, power, and mortality are relentless. As he aged, Hideyoshi's empire began to show fractures, his heirs too weak to hold the vast web of loyalties together. And so, the third of the great unifiers stepped forward, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a patient and calculating man who had long walked the fine line between loyalty and self-preservation. He served both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi with steadfast caution, waiting for the moment when fate would open its hand. That moment came at the Battle of Sekigahara, 1600, a clash of titans that decided the destiny of Japan. On a fog-covered plain, two massive armies met, representing the old order and the new. Through cunning alliances, deception, and sheer endurance, Ieyasu emerged victorious. With that single victory, centuries of civil war came to an end. In 1603, Ieyasu was granted the title of shogun, founding the Tokugawa shogunate, which would rule Japan for more than 250 years of peace. The age of blood had ended. The age of order had begun. Yet, the legacy of the Sengoku era would never fade. It was a crucible that forged the essence of the samurai spirit. Courage tempered by discipline, loyalty shadowed by betrayal, and ambition bound by the inevitability of impermanence. The fields of Sekigahara still whisper of those who fell for their lords, and the castles of Nobunaga and Hideyoshi still gleam faintly in the moonlight of memory. The warlords may have passed into history, but the fire they carried reshaped Japan into a unified soul, reborn from chaos, tempered by the sword, and destined to endure through time. With the dawn of the Tokugawa shogunate, the thunder of war faded, and Japan entered an age of serenity unlike any it had ever known. The year was 1603, and from his seat at Edo, modern-day Tokyo, Tokugawa Ieyasu began weaving a new order upon the torn fabric of the nation. For centuries, Japan had been a land divided, but under Ieyasu, it would become one body, one heart, and one mind. His rule marked the end of the Sengoku Jidai, that long night of chaos, and the beginning of what historians would call the Edo period, an era of peace that would last for over 2.5 centuries. The samurai, whose lives had for generations been defined by the rhythm of the battlefield, now faced a strange and profound silence. Their swords, once wet with the blood of rivals, gleamed untouched in their scabbards. The clamor of war drums was replaced by the soft sounds of poetry, the pluck of the shamisen, and the tranquil flow of the tea ceremony. Yet beneath that serenity lay tension, the struggle of a warrior class learning to survive in a world without war. The samurai had to transform from conquerors into stewards, from fighters into philosophers. It was not the body that had to fight now, but the spirit. Ieyasu understood the delicate balance required to maintain peace among men trained for violence. He established a political system known as Bakuhan Teisei, in which the shogunate ruled from Edo while allowing regional daimyos to govern their domains under strict oversight. Every clan was required to show loyalty through the Senkin-Kotai system, alternate attendance at the shogun's court. Lords had to spend 1 year in Edo and 1 in their own provinces, leaving their families behind as hostages to ensure obedience. It was an ingenious blend of honor and control, a chain forged not from iron, but from duty and distance. Under the Tokugawa peace, cities blossomed. Edo, once a fishing village, became one of the largest and most vibrant metropolises in the world. Merchants, once scorned as the lowest of classes, flourished, creating a new urban culture of fashion, art, and entertainment. The floating world of Ukiyo, a realm of pleasure, theater, and illusion, emerged, immortalized by woodblock prints depicting courtesans, actors, and scenes of daily life. Yet the samurai, bound by their hereditary rank and stipend, often found themselves financially strained, caught between their noble ideals and the reality of a society that no longer needed their swords. It was during this time that the philosophy of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was refined into moral doctrine. What had once been a loose code of battlefield ethics became a spiritual path, emphasizing loyalty, sincerity, and inner discipline. Thinkers like Yamaga Soko and later Yamamoto Tsunetomo, the author of the Hagakure, reimagined the samurai as models of virtue in a peaceful world. The way of the samurai, Tsunetomo wrote, is found in death, not a call to violence, but a reminder of impermanence and selflessness. The warrior was to live with readiness, humility, and devotion, even if his sword remained sheathed for life. The Tokugawa shogunate was a paradox of isolation and enlightenment. Fearing foreign influence and internal unrest, Ieyasu's successors enacted the Sakoku policy, closing Japan's borders to almost all outside contact. Only a handful of Dutch and Chinese traders were permitted to conduct limited commerce at Nagasaki. Christianity, which had spread under the Jesuits, was outlawed, and converts were persecuted. To the outside world, Japan became a mystery, a hidden kingdom untouched by time. But within those borders, peace allowed art and scholarship to flourish. Haiku poets like Matsuo Basho found beauty in simplicity and silence, wandering the countryside with brush and ink instead of sword and armor. Generations passed, and the peace endured. The descendants of once great generals now served as bureaucrats, teachers, or wandering ronin, masterless samurai. Searching for purpose, their armor rusted, their blades dulled, but their spirit lingered. The samurai learned to find honor not in conquest, but in integrity, loyalty, and refinement. Tea ceremonies became their rituals of focus, calligraphy and poetry, their weapons of precision. In this transformation, the warrior ideal evolved from an external force of domination into an inner quest for harmony. For more than 2 centuries, Japan slept under the calm watch of the Tokugawa. The cherry blossoms continued to bloom and fall, the seasons turned, and the people lived without the terror of endless war. But even the most tranquil surface hides undercurrents of change. Beyond Japan's shores, the The modern world was awakening, steamships, cannons, and empires expanding across the oceans. The peace of Edo could not last forever. And when the black ships finally came from the horizon, bringing with them the thunder of the West, the samurai would once again face a test unlike any before, a final reckoning of their place in a new age. For over 2 centuries, Japan had lived in stillness, a garden sealed from the winds of the world. The Tokugawa peace had become more than a political system. It was a state of mind, an illusion of permanence. Yet even the most isolated island cannot resist the tide forever. In the year 1853, the horizon of Edo Bay darkened, not with storm clouds, but with the smoke of steam engines. The people of Japan, who had known only the creak of oars and the whisper of sails, watched in disbelief as 4 colossal warships of black iron emerged from the mist. They were commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States, and to the Japanese, they seemed like floating fortresses, breathing fire and thunder. The black ships, as they were called, had arrived to shatter the stillness of an age. Perry's message was both polite and undeniable. He demanded that Japan open its ports to trade and diplomacy, warning that refusal would bring consequences. For the shogunate, this was a crisis unlike any other. Their walls of isolation, sakoku, had protected them for generations, but now those same walls threatened to suffocate them. The Western world had transformed while Japan slept. Muskets had become rifles, sails had become steam, and the sea itself had become a highway for empires. When Perry returned the following year with even more ships, the Tokugawa shogunate had no choice but to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, ending more than 2 centuries of seclusion. What followed was a slow unraveling of the world the samurai had built. The treaties that followed, unequal and humiliating, granted foreign powers privileges that undermined Japan's sovereignty. Ports opened, foreign merchants arrived, and new ideas began to flow in like the tide. Christianity, Western science, democracy, and industry. The old order, built upon hierarchy and obedience, began to tremble. Some samurai saw opportunity in this change, envisioning a Japan reborn through modernization. Others saw only betrayal, the desecration of Bushido and the humiliation of their ancestors. From this divide, chaos once again began to rise. Among the most powerful voices calling for transformation was the slogan Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Disillusioned samurai, scholars, and peasants rallied around this cry, blaming the shogunate for Japan's weakness. Secret societies formed in Kyoto and the provinces, conspiring to restore the emperor as the true ruler of Japan. The shogunate, struggling to balance tradition and survival, cracked under the pressure. The result was civil war, known to history as the Boshin War, 1868 to 1869. A final clash between the old samurai order and the forces of a new Japan. The war was swift but devastating. On one side stood the Tokugawa loyalists, armed with honor and old ways. On the other, the imperial forces equipped with modern rifles, cannons, and Western tactics. The ancient samurai charges, once unstoppable on horseback, were mowed down by gunfire. The world of the sword was dying under the roar of gunpowder. The decisive Battle of Toba, Fushimi marked the end of Tokugawa rule. The imperial banners of the Meiji Restoration rose above Kyoto, and for the first time in over 250 years, the emperor ruled once more, not as a figurehead, but as the symbol of a modern nation. Yet the victory of modernization was not without sorrow. For many samurai, the fall of the shogunate meant the loss of identity itself. Their privileges were abolished, their stipends dissolved, their swords banned from public wear. The very class that had once shaped Japan's destiny was suddenly cast adrift. Some adapted, serving as teachers, officers, or bureaucrats in the new Meiji government. Others could not bear the humiliation. Among them was Seigo Takamori, the last samurai, who led the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, a desperate attempt to restore the samurai spirit in an age of machines and modern armies. The rebellion was noble, but doomed. Outnumbered, outgunned, and facing Japan's newly trained conscript army, Seigo's forces fought valiantly, their katana gleaming against rifles and cannons. When defeat became inevitable, Seigo performed seppuku, the ritual suicide that embodied the final act of Bushido. His death marked the end of an era, the last echo of the warrior age fading into history. The samurai were gone, but their spirit endured. The Meiji government, in reshaping Japan, kept their virtues alive: discipline, loyalty, honor, and devotion to duty. The modern Japanese army and education system were built upon these ideals. Even as the sword gave way to the pen, the samurai code remained, invisible yet unbroken, guiding Japan through its transformation into a modern power. And so the Black Ships had brought not only the end of isolation, but also a rebirth. The samurai fell, but their legacy rose anew in every part of Japanese life, from art to industry, from philosophy to nationalism. The warriors who once ruled with steel now ruled through spirit, their presence lingering in every heartbeat of the nation they had built. Though the age of the sword had ended, the spirit of the samurai did not vanish, it transformed. In the wake of the Meiji Restoration, Japan entered an age of breathtaking change. The old castles that once housed proud warriors became barracks, schools, and government halls. Steam engines roared across lands that had once known only the rhythm of hooves, and factories rose where rice fields once stretched to the horizon. Yet amid this storm of progress, the ideals of the samurai remained like an unbroken thread connecting past and present. Even stripped of their titles and swords, the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, found new life within the hearts of a modern nation learning to balance honor with progress. In every corner of Meiji Japan, the ghosts of the samurai whispered reminders of duty and discipline. Former warriors took up new roles as teachers, administrators, and officers in the imperial army. The new soldiers who carried rifles instead of katanas were taught not merely how to fight, but how to be, to face hardship with endurance, to value loyalty above comfort, and to die, if necessary, for one's nation. What had once been the code of the warrior became the moral foundation of an empire reborn. The Bushido spirit infused every layer of society, from the classroom to the battlefield, turning Japan's modernization into something uniquely its own, a fusion of steel and soul. Writers and philosophers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries helped enshrine this spirit into the national consciousness. Naitobe Inatsu's famous book Bushido, The Soul of Japan, sought to explain the samurai ethic to the Western world, portraying it as Japan's invisible religion, a faith built upon courage, righteousness, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. His words resonated deeply, both at home and abroad. For the Japanese, it was a reminder that progress need not erase tradition. For the West, it was a glimpse into the heart of a culture that had achieved balance between modernity and morality. Through Naitobe's pen, the ancient warriors were reborn as moral philosophers of the modern age. The arts, too, became the vessel through which samurai ideals lived on. In kabuki and no theater, the tales of loyalty and sacrifice continued to stir hearts. Poets composed verses on the fleeting nature of life, echoing the old warrior's acceptance of death as part of duty. Even the tea ceremony, long practiced by samurai to cultivate serenity before battle, endured as a symbol of grace and discipline. The aesthetic of the sword, the simplicity, the precision, the respect for balance, shaped everything from architecture to calligraphy. The samurai's mastery of death had become, paradoxically, a celebration of life lived with purpose. In the military, Bushido found a darker reflection. As Japan rose as a modern imperial power, the samurai ideal was revived not as a personal code, but as a tool of nationalism. Soldiers of the early 20th century were taught that to die for the emperor was the highest honor, a distortion of Bushido's original spirit, yet born from the same root of loyalty and sacrifice. The same virtues that had once governed duels and honor-bound service were now invoked in global wars. The samurai's calm resolve, his disdain for fear, his devotion to cause, All were recast in the furnace of modern conflict. By the time of the Second World War, the warrior's code had become a national ethos, both noble and tragic in its transformation. But beyond war and empire, the samurai continued to shape Japan's soul in subtler, quieter ways. In the diligence of craftsmen, in the precision of martial arts, in the courtesy of everyday interaction, echoes of Bushido endure. The master swordsmith forging a blade, the calligrapher tracing perfect lines, the martial artist bowing before the dojo door, all are modern incarnations of that same pursuit of perfection that once defined the samurai. Their battlefield has changed, but their struggle remains eternal, the quest to master oneself. In the world beyond Japan, the samurai became icons of mystery and inspiration. Artists, historians, and dreamers from every culture found fascination in their stoic beauty and tragic nobility. From the inked scrolls of Edo to the silver screens of Hollywood, the samurai's silhouette, the figure in armor beneath the rising sun, became a symbol of integrity in a chaotic world. They came to represent something universal, the belief that even in the face of change, there exists a way to live and die with honor. Thus, though the sword was laid to rest, the samurai lived on in spirit. Their armor rusted, their castles crumbled, but their legacy became eternal, woven into the language, the art, and the soul of Japan itself. Like cherry blossoms that bloom only to fall, the samurai remind us that beauty is fleeting, that strength lies in restraint, and that true honor is found not in victory, but in the grace with which one faces defeat. The last echoes of their footsteps fade through history's corridors, but if you listen closely, beyond the hum of modern life, you can still hear them. The quiet rustle of silk over armor, the soft ring of a blade drawn not for conquest, but for purpose. The way of the samurai has never truly died. It simply became the heartbeat of a nation that learned to stand unbowed before time itself. As the centuries turned and Japan's old world gave way to the steel and glass of modernity, the philosophy of Bushido, the way of the warrior, transcended its origins as a martial creed. It became something far greater, a spiritual compass guiding the Japanese soul through the turbulence of change. Once meant to shape the conduct of those who wielded the sword, Bushido evolved into an ethical code that defined what it meant to live with dignity, to strive for excellence, and to endure with quiet strength. Though its roots were born in the clamor of battle, its leaves reached into the calm of everyday life, shading generations who had never drawn a blade. The samurai's ancient ideals found new purpose in the age of progress. When the clatter of weapons was replaced by the hum of factories, and the armor was traded for business suits, the spirit of Bushido adapted without losing its essence. In the boardrooms of the 20th century, in the halls of education, and even in the meticulous craft of artisans, the same virtues that once guided warriors, honor, loyalty, self-discipline, and integrity, were reborn as the pillars of modern Japanese identity. To live with kokoro, heart, and to act with gi, righteousness, became not the path of warriors alone, but the mark of all who sought to serve their community and their craft. In this transformation, Japan demonstrated a truth few civilizations have achieved, that the essence of strength lies not in conquest, but in character. The samurai, once feared for their skill in war, became revered for their moral courage and peace. This shift was not without struggle. After the devastation of war and the weight of defeat in the mid-20th century, Japan faced an identity fractured by history. Yet it was the silent endurance, the stoicism inherited from the warriors of old, that helped the nation rebuild. Cities in ruins were resurrected with the same precision and patience once reserved for sword forging. Factories became the new battlefields, and innovation became the new form of victory. Through this, Bushido lived on, not as a cry for war, but as a quiet vow to rise again, stronger and wiser. The global fascination with Bushido grew in tandem with Japan's rise as a modern power. Western thinkers, scholars, and artists began to see in this ancient code a reflection of universal values long obscured by materialism and chaos. To many, Bushido represented a moral purity, a way to live with grace and purpose in a world that had forgotten restraint. Philosophers compared it to the chivalric codes of medieval Europe, but where Western knighthood often sought divine validation, Bushido found its strength in introspection. The samurai's battle was not merely against others, it was against the self. To master fear, to act without selfishness, to face death unflinchingly. These were not acts of war, but of enlightenment. Artists and storytellers across the world became captivated by the imagery of the lone samurai, a figure who stood apart, governed by principle rather than circumstance. In literature, film, and art, the samurai became a symbol of inner discipline in a world of noise. Akira Kurosawa's films immortalized this archetype, men bound by honor in a world crumbling around them, their swords gleaming not with violence, but with moral clarity. The West embraced this vision with reverence, from Hollywood's cowboy heroes to the stoic protagonists of modern cinema. Echoes of Bushido resonate still. The path of the warrior had become a metaphor for the journey of every human being seeking meaning amid chaos. Yet Bushido is not a relic of nostalgia. In Japan's modern culture, it breathes quietly beneath the surface. It can be seen in the discipline of the martial artist who bows before stepping onto the tatami, in the humility of the tea master preparing each movement with perfection, in the tireless work ethic that values mastery over recognition. Even in silence, Bushido speaks, a reminder that one's worth is measured not by success, but by the integrity of one's actions. The warrior's calm composure before the storm has become the citizen's composure before adversity. The battlefield has shifted, but the warrior's heart remains unchanged. At its core, Bushido teaches the acceptance of impermanence, the understanding that all things, even glory and life itself, are fleeting. Like the cherry blossom that blooms brilliantly only to fall within days, the samurai's honor was found in embracing the transience of existence. This philosophy continues to guide those who seek balance in an age of constant motion. It is a lesson for the modern soul, to live beautifully, knowing that every moment, like every breath, is borrowed. Thus, the sword has become a symbol not of battle, but of balance. The katana, once an instrument of death, now represents the sharpened edge of the spirit, discipline honed by reflection, strength tempered by compassion. And Bushido, once the path of a chosen few, now belongs to all who choose to walk through life with unwavering honor. The samurai may have vanished into history, but their philosophy remains eternal, an invisible armor against the uncertainty of time, a quiet reminder that true mastery lies not in the sword you wield, but in the heart that wields it. In the heart of samurai culture, no object held more meaning, reverence, or spiritual depth than the katana, the curved, slender blade that came to embody the soul of the warrior. To the Western eye, it was a weapon of unmatched beauty and lethality. But to the samurai, it was far more than a tool of war. It was a living extension of the spirit, a mirror of the owner's discipline, honor, and inner balance. The forging of a sword was not an act of metallurgy, but of sacred creation. It was said that a true blade was born, not made, its soul awakened in the fire, shaped by devotion, and cooled by prayer. Each sword carried not only the smith's craft, but his purity of heart. The swordsmiths of Japan were regarded almost as priests, guardians of an art form that connected the physical to the divine. Working in small forges, often in isolation, they prepared themselves as if entering ritual, fasting, meditating, and purifying their spirits before striking the first blow. The process of forging a katana could take weeks or even months. Layers of steel were folded upon themselves thousands of times, creating both resilience and flexibility, a duality reflecting the samurai's own nature, unyielding in honor, yet adaptable in spirit. As sparks danced and hammers sang through the night, the blade took shape in fire's embrace, absorbing the breath and will of its creator. When it was quenched in water, it was believed that the soul of the sword was sealed within, forever binding it to the essence of the craftsman and the destiny of the one who would wield it. Each blade was unique, not merely in its curve or temper line, but in its personality. The swordsmith's signature, his mei, etched upon the tang, was not a mark of pride but of responsibility. For the smith knew that his creation might one day decide the life or death of its bearer. Thus, a katana was not made for vanity or ornament. It was forged with solemn intention. Some swords were believed to be good, possessing a calm spirit that protected the wielder and struck only with justice. Others were cursed, said to thirst for blood, their creation marred by malice or sorrow in the maker's heart. Whether truth or superstition, these beliefs revealed how deeply the Japanese intertwined spirit with steel, morality with metal. To draw one's sword was not a casual act. It was a covenant with one's ancestors, with one's code, and with the unseen balance of the world. The samurai carried his katana with the reverence one would give a relic. It was worn edge up, symbolizing readiness not for aggression, but for swift, precise defense. The act of unsheathing, a motion known as iajutsu, was an art. In itself, a test of presence and calmness. A true swordsman could strike and sheath in a single, seamless motion, never disturbing the air beyond necessity. Every gesture, from cleaning the blade to returning it to its scabbard, was performed with ritual precision, as though communing with something divine. In battle, the katana was both executioner and protector. Its balance allowed for movements of unparalleled grace, each strike a dance of life and death, governed by clarity of mind. The samurai believed that victory was determined before the sword ever touched its target. Hesitation, anger, or fear could taint the purity of the strike. To fight with a clouded spirit was to betray both blade and self. Thus, mastery of the sword required mastery of the soul. This harmony between body and spirit became known as Kinzen Ichinyo. The sword and Zen are one. The sword was not only the path to death, but the path to enlightenment. Beyond the battlefield, the katana took on a quieter, symbolic role. During the long peace of the Edo period, when open warfare faded, the sword became a sign of status and moral duty rather than violence. Samurai wore their paired swords, the daisho, meaning big and small, as emblems of their honor. The longer katana symbolized the warrior's public life, while the shorter wakizashi represented his inner spirit, his private world. Even in an age when swords were rarely drawn, they remained sacred, reminders that discipline, courage, and virtue could not be surrendered, even in times of peace. When the Meiji Restoration outlawed the public wearing of swords in the 19th century, many samurai felt as though their souls had been taken from them. But even as their blades were set aside, the ideals they represented endured. Today, the katana lives on as a masterpiece of art and philosophy. In museums and private collections, each blade still seems to hum faintly with the fire of its creation, a resonance from another age. To those who gaze upon its curve, it whispers not of war, but of harmony, the balance between destruction and creation, discipline and freedom, mortality and eternity. And so, the katana endures as a silent teacher. Its form reminds us that perfection is not found in flawlessness, but in balance. Its history teaches that true strength is not in the edge that cuts, but in the hand that wields it with purpose. In every reflection upon its polished surface lies the same eternal truth the samurai once lived by, that the soul, like the sword, must be tempered in fire, folded through experience, and kept sharp not by anger, but by wisdom. To understand the samurai, one must look beyond the battlefield and into the rhythm of their daily lives, the quiet discipline, the spiritual rigor, and the unwavering devotion to Bushido, the way of the warrior. Though they were men of war, the samurai did not spend every day with blade in hand. Their existence was guided by a balance between martial practice, scholarly study, and moral refinement. A true samurai was expected not only to fight bravely but to live with dignity, speak with wisdom, and die with honor. Every sunrise was a reminder of impermanence, every moment an opportunity to embody harmony between strength and serenity. A typical day for a samurai began before dawn, when the world was still veiled in silence. Rising early was an act of mindfulness, a gesture of respect toward life itself. Before the first rays of light touched the tatama mats, the samurai would sit in meditation, breathing in stillness, calming the heart. Zen Buddhism played a profound role in shaping this inner discipline. It taught that victory begins in the mind and that clarity, not fury, is the warrior's greatest weapon. Through meditation, the samurai sought mushin no shin, the mind without mind, a state of flow where thought and action are one, and hesitation vanishes like morning mist. After meditation, the day unfolded with structure and ritual. The samurai would carefully don his garments, each layer arranged with purpose. His armor, when worn, was not merely protection but a statement of readiness, discipline, and respect. Every piece, from the lacquered plates to the knotted cords, symbolized patience and precision. To put on armor without care was to insult the code that defined him. Meals, too, were conducted with restraint. Even the act of eating was performed in silence and moderation, reflecting gratitude for sustenance and mindfulness of impermanence. Training occupied much of a samurai's time. Swordsmanship, archery, horseback riding, and spear combat were central disciplines, but they were always accompanied by the arts of calligraphy, poetry, and philosophy. This harmony of war and art was the essence of Bunbu Ryodo, the dual way of pen and sword. A samurai might spend hours practicing precise sword strikes under the scorching sun, only to retreat in the evening to compose haiku beneath a lantern's glow. To be unrefined in culture was as shameful as to be weak in combat. Poetry honed emotional awareness. Calligraphy cultivated focus. Tea ceremony taught patience and grace. Through these practices, the warrior learned not only to conquer enemies, but to master himself. Honor governed every aspect of life. The samurai lived by Bushido, a moral code that valued loyalty, courage, honesty, and compassion. Loyalty was paramount. A samurai's life belonged not to himself, but to his lord. Disobedience, even in thought, was an act of betrayal. Yet Bushido also emphasized mercy and righteousness. To be cruel or arrogant was to disgrace the warrior's spirit. Each decision, no matter how small, was measured against the invisible scale of honor. When words were spoken, they were deliberate and restrained. When conflict arose, it was faced directly, without deceit or cowardice. Even in moments of failure, the samurai sought redemption through resolve and sincerity, for disgrace could only be cleansed by truth, or, in the most extreme cases, by the act of seppuku. But the life of a samurai was not without burden. Beneath the calm exterior, many wrestled with the contradictions of their existence. Men trained to kill, yet devoted to peace. Bound to serve, yet yearning for autonomy. In times of prolonged peace, especially during the Edo period, many samurai found themselves without battlefields to test their mettle. Instead, they became bureaucrats, teachers, poets, and philosophers, warriors without wars. Yet even then, the Bushido spirit persisted. The sword became a metaphor for self-discipline, the battlefield a symbol for life itself. A duel could take place not with blades, but with ideas, loyalty, or willpower. Within the household, discipline extended to family life. A samurai's home was a reflection of order and humility. Simplicity was beauty. Tatama floors, sliding paper doors, a single flower arranged with precision in a tokonoma alcove. Children were taught obedience and endurance from a young age. Boys learned martial arts, strategy, and filial duty. Girls were taught etiquette, household management, and resilience, for they too bore the weight of honor. The samurai wife was often the quiet pillar of the household, calm, faithful, and courageous. In times of war, she could take up the blade herself, protecting her family's legacy with the same resolve as her husband. Evenings were moments of reflection. As the lanterns flickered and the world grew still, a samurai might write poetry, study the classics of Confucius, or engage in philosophical conversation. The night air was a time to measure one's soul, to ensure one's heart was pure, one's thoughts clear, and one's path true. For the samurai knew that tomorrow might never come. Death was a constant companion, not to be feared but embraced as part of existence. To live without fear of death was the highest expression of freedom. In this quiet rhythm of life, the samurai discovered what it meant to truly live with purpose. His world was one of paradox, steel and silk, violence and poetry, duty and compassion. Yet within that paradox lay harmony, a balance achieved through centuries of discipline and devotion. For the samurai, to master the sword was to master the self, and to master the self was to touch eternity. The heart of the samurai's world beat to the rhythm of Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was more than a set of rules. It was a moral compass, a spiritual doctrine, and a way of life that shaped every thought and action. While it was never written in a single sacred text, Bushido emerged as a synthesis of ancient values drawn from Confucian ethics, Buddhist philosophy, and Shinto purity. It was both sword and soul, binding warriors to ideals greater than victory or survival. Through Bushido, the samurai found purpose not merely in fighting but in living with grace, dying with dignity, and preserving the fragile balance between power and virtue. At its core, Bushido demanded righteousness, the moral courage to do what is right, even when it led to ruin. A samurai was expected to act with justice and integrity, to never betray his conscience or his word. Was the foundation upon which all other virtues stood, for without moral clarity, strength and skill were hollow. Then came courage, but not the reckless bravery of fools. Rather, the quiet strength to face adversity, pain, and death without flinching. True courage was found not on the battlefield alone, but in the willingness to stand for truth, to accept failure with grace, and to face one's destiny without regret. Compassion, followed close behind, a reminder that the sword's true power lay in restraint. The samurai was taught that mercy was not weakness, but mastery over anger. The greatest warrior could kill with a single stroke, but chose peace when possible. A lord who ruled through cruelty lost not only loyalty but honor, while one who tempered justice with empathy inspired devotion. Respect, was another pillar, an acknowledgement of hierarchy, tradition, and the sanctity of others. From bowing before elders to observing ritual in battle, every gesture carried the weight of meaning. Even an enemy was owed respect, for without respect, battle descended into barbarism. Makoto, honesty, was sacred. Lies, deceit, and hidden motives were poison to the samurai spirit. A man's word was his bond, and a promise broken was a stain on his soul. The spoken truth was a sword sharper than steel, capable of cutting through illusion. A samurai who could not be trusted was already defeated. Alongside it stood honor, the essence of self-worth and reputation. Honor was not granted by birth or title, but earned through conduct. It was invisible yet absolute, a treasure that could be lost in a moment of cowardice. To the samurai, dishonor was worse than death. Many chose the blade of seppuku, ritual suicide, over the disgrace of moral failure, proving that Bushido valued integrity beyond life itself. Lastly, loyalty, bound all virtues together. The samurai's loyalty to his daimyo, family, and clan was unwavering, extending even beyond death. Betrayal was unthinkable, for loyalty was not only duty but identity. A samurai's spirit was a reflection of the bonds he honored. Yet, this devotion was not blind obedience. It demanded wisdom and balance. A truly righteous warrior served his lord with heart, but his conscience served truth above all. Though Bushido took centuries to evolve, its essence was timeless. In early feudal Japan, during the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, its principles were more practical, a warrior's discipline forged through combat and hierarchy. But as Japan entered the Edo period and peace reigned, Bushido transformed into a philosophical ideal. Without wars to fight, the sword turned inward. Samurai became scholars and poets, their battles fought within the mind. Bushido became a mirror of the human spirit, shaping not just how a warrior died, but how he lived, with humility, loyalty, and mindfulness. Zen Buddhism gave Bushido its depth. It taught impermanence, detachment, and inner clarity. A samurai trained his mind to remain calm in chaos, like a still pond reflecting the moon. Life and death were but two waves in the same ocean. This acceptance of mortality freed him from fear, allowing him to act without hesitation. Shinto, on the other hand, infused Bushido with purity and devotion, reverence for ancestors, nature, and the unseen spirits that guided destiny. Confucianism contributed social order and duty, reminding the samurai of his place within the web of loyalty and justice. Together, these philosophies shaped a code unlike any other in history. Even beyond the battlefield, Bushido shaped Japan's moral fabric. Merchants learned honesty from it, craftsmen learned diligence, and rulers learned compassion. The code transcended swords and armor. It became the invisible law of conduct that defined Japanese identity. The restraint, politeness, and precision still admired in modern Japan echo the echoes of Bushido. Though the samurai class fell in the late 19th century, their code did not die. It evolved, appearing in the discipline of martial arts, the ethos of business, the art of craftsmanship, and the spirit of perseverance. The Bushido ideal remains eternal because it speaks to something universal, the human desire to live with purpose, courage, and integrity. Whether on the battlefield or in daily life, its wisdom endures, to act with honor when no one watches, to face hardship without fear, and to live and die in accordance with one's principles. The sword may rust, the armor may fade, but the soul of Bushido, calm, resolute, and pure, remains unbroken through time. As the ideals of Bushido took root, Japan's political landscape began to shift beneath the tread of armored feet. The Heian court in Kyoto had long ruled with elegance and ritual, its nobles composing poetry by candlelight while warriors guarded distant provinces. But beneath that surface calm, power was quietly changing hands. The imperial court, bound by ceremony and intrigue, had grown detached from the realities of war and governance. In the far reaches of the archipelago, clans of samurai rose to defend the land, clans whose loyalty was not to the emperor's courtly whims, but to strength, survival, and the honor of their bloodlines. Among these, two names would burn brighter than any others, the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry would forge a new era and birth the first military government Japan had ever known. The Minamoto clan, descendants of emperors turned warriors, carved their legacy through generations of service and struggle. They were men of the frontier, disciplined, pragmatic, and bound by duty. Their ancestors had been imperial princes, but by the late Heian period, they had become hardened generals commanding armies in the provinces. The Taira, by contrast, thrived within the capital. Wealthy, sophisticated, and politically cunning, they mastered the arts of diplomacy as much as the arts of war. Their leader, Taira no Kayamori, rose higher than any warrior before him, marrying his family into the imperial line and seizing control of the government itself. For the first time, a samurai ruled Japan in all but name. But absolute power, like still water, hides the seeds of its own storm. The Taira's rise bred resentment. Their dominance in the imperial court stifled rivals, their arrogance kindled rebellion, and the Minamoto, long suppressed, began to stir again in the shadows. When Prince Machihito, a royal frustrated with Taira control, called upon the Minamoto to rise in arms, the islands of Japan trembled. The year was 1180, and the Genpei War had begun, a conflict that would shatter the old order and define the future of the nation. The war raged for 5 years, fought across misty valleys, coastal plains, and sacred rivers. It was a clash of not only armies but ideals. The refined courtly power of the Taira against the austere martial discipline of the Minamoto. Heroes emerged from the chaos. Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the brilliant and tragic tactician. His elder brother Yoritomo, cold, strategic, and destined for power, and countless others whose names were etched into ballads and painted scrolls. Yoshitsune's daring victories at Ichi-no-Tani and Dan-no-Yura became legend. He was said to have moved like lightning, using terrain, deception, and speed to overcome forces many times his own. The final battle at Danayura in 1185 saw the Taira navy annihilated in the narrow straits, samurai leaping from ships, banners burning, and nobles drowning as the sea swallowed their dynasty. The Taira were no more. Out of the ashes, Minamoto no Yoritomo stood as Japan's supreme power. Yet, unlike Kayamori, he did not seek the glittering throne in Kyoto. He saw the emperor as a divine figurehead, a symbol rather than a sovereign. Real power, Yoritomo understood, lay not in ceremony, but in command. From his base in Kamakura, far from the capital's intrigues, he built a new kind of government, the Bakufu, the shogunate, or Tenk government. It was the beginning of the Kamakura period and a transformation of Japan itself. The emperor remained, cloaked in sacred authority, but it was the shogun, the generalissimo, who ruled the realm. Under Yoritomo, the samurai class gained formal recognition as the backbone of the nation. Land, loyalty, and law flowed through the network of gokunin, or vassals, who pledged their swords to the shogun. In return, they received protection, land rights, and honor. The Bushi warriors, who once served scattered lords, were now bound to a centralized military order. The age of aristocratic dominance had ended. The age of the warrior had begun. Yet Yoritomo's triumph was shadowed by tragedy. His brother Yoshitsune, once his greatest ally, became his greatest threat. Praised by the court and loved by the people, Yoshitsune's fame grew too bright for the shogun's liking. Yoritomo, wary of betrayal, declared him an outlaw. The once inseparable brothers became enemies, and Yoshitsune's flight and eventual death in 1189 became one of Japan's most mournful tales. It was a reminder that even in victory, the samurai's world was ruled by the knife's edge of loyalty and ambition. The establishment of the shogunate was more than a political shift. It was the dawn of a new philosophy of rule. The capital of elegance and poetry had yielded to the fortress of discipline and order. Japan was no longer governed by courtiers, but by soldiers. The Minamoto had carved their destiny in iron and blood, and their legacy would shape the nation's path for centuries. Beneath their banners, the concept of Japan itself began to change, from a courtly empire to a land defined by its warriors, bound together under the silent gaze of the shogun. And in the quiet halls of Kamakura, where the sea's breath whispered through pine trees and the sound of temple bells echoed across the valley, the samurai's world found its first true home. The rise of the Kamakura shogunate brought order to Japan, a hard, disciplined peace forged by the sword and bound by loyalty. Yet, even the most formidable walls of discipline could not silence the roar of destiny. Beyond the seas, far to the west, an empire unlike any the world had ever known was spreading across the continents like wildfire. The Mongols, under the command of Genghis Khan and his descendants, had conquered half the known world. From the steppes of Central Asia to the gates of Europe, their banners had cast long shadows. By the late 13th century, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, ruled China as emperor of the Yuan dynasty, his ambitions. To the Mongols, Japan was a stubborn speck beyond the horizon, an untamed nation of warriors who had refused to submit to the might of the Khan. Letters were sent to Kamakura demanding tribute and allegiance. But Japan's shogun, Hojo Tokugawa, guardian of the shogunate after the Minamoto line, answered not with submission but silence. The Mongols' messengers were dismissed, or, by some accounts, executed. The Khan's pride was wounded, and from that wound flowed war. In 1274, the Mongols launched their first invasion, assembling an armada of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans united under the storm banners of conquest. They landed on the island of Tsushima first, where samurai defenders met them with courage and steel. Yet, to their shock, the enemy fought differently than any they had faced before. The Mongols advanced in disciplined ranks, using coordinated volleys of arrows, catapults that hurled exploding bombs, and thick armor that dulled the edge of the katana. The samurai, trained for single combat steeped in ritual and honor, struggled against this brutal, collective warfare. For the first time, Japan faced an enemy whose power was not just martial, but technological and overwhelming. The Mongol army swept through Hakata Bay on Kyushu, burning villages and cutting down defenders. For a moment, it seemed Japan's fate would mirror the countless nations that had fallen before the Khans. But then, as night fell and the winds began to howl, fate turned its gaze. A great storm rose from the sea, violent, cold, and relentless. The waves tore through the Mongol fleet, smashing ships against rocks, swallowing men by the thousands. What the sword could not stop, the storm destroyed. The surviving invaders fled, leaving Japan bloodied but unbroken. In the wake of the attack, the shogunate braced for the inevitable return. Hojo Tokugawa, stern and unyielding, ordered the construction of vast coastal defenses, stone walls along the shores of Hakata, fortifications manned by thousands of samurai who trained, prayed, and waited. 7 years passed. In 1281, Kublai Khan returned, this time with an even greater force, some say over 140,000 men and 4,000 ships, the largest amphibious invasion the world would see until modern times. Again, the Mongols struck Tsushima and Iki before descending upon Kyushu. The battles were fierce, and Japan's defenders fought with ferocity, launching daring night raids on Mongol camps and setting fire to enemy ships. Yet again, as the fighting reached its peak, the heavens stirred. Winds gathered over the horizon, first a whisper, then a fury. A typhoon swept across the sea, battering the Mongol fleet for 2 days and nights. Ships collided, splintered, and sank. Soldiers drowned in their armor, their cries swallowed by the ocean. When the storm passed, tens of thousands were dead, and the rest were scattered or slain. The Japanese called it kamikaze, the divine wind. To them, it was not mere chance, but divine intervention. The gods of Shinto, the spirits of their ancestors, had protected their sacred islands. The Mongols never returned, and Japan stood as one of the few nations never conquered by the Khans. Yet, beneath the triumph, there was a quieter story, one of exhaustion and cost. The shogunate had poured all its resources into the war, rewarding few with spoils, for there had been no territory gained, no treasure seized. Many samurai who had fought for honor found themselves destitute, their loyalty strained by the very code that bound them. Still, the legend of the divine wind endured, carried on temple banners, and whispered in prayer. It became more than history, it became faith. In the centuries to come, kamikaze would come to symbolize not merely a storm, but a spirit, the idea that Japan itself was protected by unseen hands, that its people and land were bound by something eternal and sacred. For the samurai of the 13th century, it was a sign. The gods had not only spared their nation, they had reaffirmed their path. The sword, the storm, and the spirit were one. And though the Mongol threat had passed, Japan's warriors now faced a different kind of battle, one within themselves, between the demands of loyalty, the weight of peace, and the quiet hunger for meaning in a land forged by war. After the storms had faded and the Mongol threat was no more, Japan entered an age of reflection. The sword had protected the nation, but now the spirit sought balance. For centuries, the samurai had lived and died by the blade, their honor written in blood and their loyalty tested by war. Yet as peace began to settle across the islands, a quieter question emerged among them. What does a warrior become when there is no war to fight? It was in this silence that Zen Buddhism found its deepest roots in the soul of the samurai. Originating from China's Chan tradition and brought to Japan by wandering monks, Zen offered not just a religion, but a way of being, direct, disciplined, and wordless. Its teachings rejected elaborate rituals and scriptures. Instead, it sought enlightenment through simplicity, meditation, and self-mastery. To the samurai, who had long honed their bodies through rigorous training, Zen offered the same discipline for the mind. A warrior seated in stillness before dawn, breathing with the rhythm of the universe, that became the new image of strength. In the flicker of a candle, a samurai found the same truth he once sought on the battlefield. clarity, impermanence, and the acceptance of death. The tea ceremony, the arrangement of flowers, the ink brush that danced across parchment, all became paths to inner peace, reflections of the same balance found in the cut of a sword. The perfection of form, the beauty of restraint, the mastery of one's own spirit. These were not luxuries of peace, but necessities of survival in a world where death could come in a heartbeat. From Zen and the traditions of Confucian loyalty emerged Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was never a single written code, but a living philosophy woven from centuries of practice, poetry, and pain. It demanded Ji, righteousness, Yu, courage, Jin, benevolence, Rei, respect, Makoto, honesty, Meo, honor, and Chugi, loyalty. To the samurai, these were not words, they were breath itself. To live without honor was to die while breathing. To live with integrity, even in death, was to achieve immortality. In the temples of Kyoto and Kamakura, monks and swordsmen trained side by side. The clatter of bamboo swords mixed with the ring of temple bells. The masters taught that victory was not found in overpowering one's opponent, but in conquering the self. When you understand the way broadly, one Zen master would later say, you see it in all things. The samurai learned that every movement, every bow, every breath, every draw of the blade was part of an endless dance between life and death. The katana itself became the sacred embodiment of the samurai's soul, forged from layers of steel, folded and hammered with reverence, its creation a spiritual act. Swordsmiths prayed before their work, purified themselves in ritual, and whispered sutras as the metal took shape. Each blade carried not only lethal precision, but a quiet perfection, a mirror to its wielder's heart. The samurai would bow before his sword, not as a weapon, but as a companion, the vessel of his honor, the measure of his spirit. In those years of introspection, the art of dying became as important as the art of living. Death was not to be feared. It was to be embraced as part of the great balance. The practice of seppuku, ritual suicide, though grim to later eyes, was to them the purest expression of devotion and responsibility. To die by one's own hand, rather than live with shame, was the final act of control over fate. To a samurai, it was not despair, but a declaration that no one, not even the world itself, could strip away one's honor. As the centuries passed, Zen and Bushido became intertwined threads in the fabric of Japan's identity. The warrior and the monk, once so different, shared the same path, the stillness before the storm, the silence after the strike. Even in art, literature, and theater, the ideals of restraint and balance shaped the Japanese soul. The ink-wash paintings known as sumie, the rock gardens of Ryoanji, the soft rustle of silk robes in no drama, all whispered the same truth that the samurai had come to know. Beauty lies in simplicity, and meaning in the transient. By the time the great wars of old began to fade, the samurai had become more than soldiers. They were statesmen, poets, teachers, and patrons of culture. The sword was still their soul, but now it rested in scabbards gilded with wisdom. The battlefield had shifted from open plains to the heart itself. And there, in the quiet dawn light, a samurai sitting beneath a cherry tree might find enlightenment not through bloodshed, but through stillness, the understanding that life's greatest battle is to master one's own mind. Zen had given the warrior something no weapon could, peace. Bushido had given him purpose beyond victory. And together, they had forged not just the samurai's code, but the soul of Japan. As centuries turned and dynasties shifted, the serenity that Zen and Bushido brought to Japan began to fracture under the weight of ambition. The Kamakura shogunate, which had once unified the warrior class under the Minamoto clan, eventually fell to internal strife and political intrigue. In its place rose a new power, the Ashikaga shogunate. Born in 1336 under the banner of Ashikaga Takauji, a general who rebelled against his own masters in a storm of loyalty and betrayal. What began as an attempt to restore imperial authority instead birthed another age of warrior rule, one that would be marked by both dazzling culture and relentless conflict. The Ashikaga era, also known as the Muromachi period, was a paradox, a world of refined beauty standing beside brutal chaos. From their capital in Kyoto's Muromachi district, the Ashikaga shoguns sought to blend art and authority, creating a court that glimmered with elegance even as the countryside burned. The early shoguns patronized temples, gardens, and painters, turning Kyoto into a jewel of Zen-inspired artistry. In this golden light, tea masters perfected their rituals, ink painters captured mountains in a single brushstroke, and poets sought enlightenment in the whisper of falling leaves. Yet beneath the surface of serenity, Japan began to splinter once again. Power was never absolute, and the shogunate's grasp extended only as far as its armies could reach. Provinces ruled by ambitious daimyo, regional lords, began to act as kings in their own right, raising armies and fortifying castles. The bonds of loyalty that once tied samurai to their masters began to stretch thin, twisted by politics, greed, and the endless hunger for land. Each province became its own domain, and each lord, a rising sun in his own sky. As shoguns weakened, the land descended into what would become known as the Sengoku Jidai, the age of the warring states. From the mid-15th to the early 17th century, Japan was torn apart by ceaseless conflict. Castles rose like mountains across the landscape, and fields that once grew rice became battlefields painted in dust and fire. Armies marched beneath banners emblazoned with clan crests, each one representing dreams of supremacy, vengeance, or survival. Samurai who had once served under noble houses now wandered as ronin, masterless men bound to no lord but the code that still lingered in their hearts. But even amid this chaos, the spirit of Bushido endured. The sword became not only a weapon of conquest, but a measure of moral resolve. A samurai's worth was still weighed not in his victories, but in his loyalty, his courage, and his restraint. Chronicles of the era speak not just of carnage, but of moments of deep humanity. Enemies pausing to bow before battle, warriors composing death poems before charging into hopeless fights, and generals showing mercy to the defeated in a fleeting glimpse of compassion. The battlefield was brutal, yet it was also sacred ground, where men tested the essence of their souls. The Ashikaga shoguns themselves became shadows of their early grandeur. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the most brilliant among them, briefly restored peace and prosperity in the 14th century. His palace, the Kinkakuji, or Golden Pavilion, shimmered above its pond like a vision from a dream, a testament to the balance between nature, art, and the impermanence of all things. But his descendants lacked his strength. As faction turned against faction, the capital itself became a war zone. The Yunnan War, 1467 to 1477, shattered what remained of central authority, reducing Kyoto to ash and plunging Japan into over a century of feudal anarchy. Out of this devastation, however, rose a new kind of samurai, hardened, pragmatic, and visionary. The wars forged legends. Oda Nobunaga, who would wage fire and iron to unite Japan. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who rose from peasant origins to rule the land. And Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would finally bring centuries of conflict to an end. But those stories still lay ahead, like distant thunder over the horizon. For now, the land was fractured, yet alive. Villages huddled beneath mountains where warlords built towering keeps. Samurai rode under blood-red moons, their armor glinting with the reflection of flames. The night air smelled of ash and cherry blossoms, beauty and death entwined as one. In this dark age of division, the samurai's purpose evolved once more. No longer mere guardians of noble courts, they became the architects of destiny. Their swords carved not just the fate of men, but the map of Japan itself. Each battle, each fall of a castle, each fleeting act of honor added another verse to the grand, tragic poem of their history. And though the world seemed to be unraveling, somewhere in the chaos was the quiet whisper of the old teachings, the echo of Zen and Bushido, reminding them that even in destruction, there was still the pursuit of harmony. In the heart of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of the warring states, Japan was a land drenched in ambition. 1,000 banners fluttered across fields once green with rice, now blackened by smoke and the march of soldiers. The emperor still sat in Kyoto, but his authority was a mere shadow, a divine name invoked but rarely obeyed. Shoguns were figureheads, their courts silenced by chaos. In their place, the daimyo, great lords of war, rose like living storms, each claiming to fight for peace, yet driven by a hunger that could never be sated. Among these men, one would rise higher and burn brighter than all others: Oda Nobunaga, the demon king of the sixth heaven. Born in 1534 in Owari province, Nobunaga was not destined for greatness. His clan was minor, his holdings small, and his manners wild, earning him the nickname, the Fool of Owari. Yet behind his reckless exterior burned a mind of astonishing vision. In a time where loyalty was currency and betrayal the rule, Nobunaga's genius lay in his refusal to play by the old rules. He saw Japan as a chessboard, and himself not as a pawn or knight, but the player who would overturn the board entirely. From the moment he seized power within his own clan, Nobunaga revealed the ruthlessness that would define his reign. Brothers, rivals, and doubters alike fell before him. But his true revolution was not merely one of politics, it was one of warfare itself. Where others relied on sword and bow, Nobunaga embraced a new force that had just arrived on Japan's shores: firearms. Portuguese traders had introduced muskets to Tanegashima Island in 1543, and Nobunaga, more than any other lord, recognized their potential. He armed his troops with arquebus, drilled them in formation, and turned battle into something mechanical, devastating, and modern. His mastery was tested at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, a defining moment of military genius. Facing the legendary Takeda cavalry, renowned for their ferocity, Nobunaga arranged his men behind wooden palisades, organized into rotating ranks of gunners. As the Takeda horses charged, volley after volley of gunfire tore through their lines. The thunder of gunpowder drowned the clash of swords, and when the smoke cleared, the field was littered with the bodies of an army that had believed itself invincible. The age of traditional warfare had ended. The future, precise, strategic, and merciless, belonged to Nobunaga. Yet, he was not only a warrior of blood, but also a visionary of order. In the chaos of the warring states, Nobunaga sought to build a new Japan, a unified realm freed from centuries of feudal stagnation. He broke the power of Buddhist monasteries that had become fortresses of war, most famously razing the Enryakuji Temple on Mount Hai in 1571, killing thousands of warrior monks. To some, this act made him a monster. To others, a liberator. He outlawed tolls and barriers, promoting free trade and movement across his territories. He welcomed foreign merchants and missionaries, not for faith, but for knowledge, for guns, maps, and clocks. In his castle at Azuchi, he built not only a stronghold, but a symbol, a seven-tiered marvel of gold and lacquer, where walls gleamed with imported art and the air itself smelled of ambition. But power, like fire, consumes even its master. Nobunaga's conquests brought him both fear and envy. His generals, once bound by awe, began to see his shadow as too vast to stand beneath. Among them was Akechi Mitsuhide, a trusted retainer, patient and calculating. In 1582, Nobunaga paused in Kyoto, planning his next campaign against the Mori clan. He lodged at the Honnoji Temple, attended by only a small guard. It was there, on a humid June morning, that Mitsuhide struck. His troops surrounded the temple, shouting, "The enemy is within." Realizing betrayal had come, Nobunaga made his final choice. He fought briefly, but as flames engulfed the temple, he took his own life, an act of defiance and dignity. The fire consumed Honnoji, turning Kyoto's sky crimson. Thus ended the life of the man who had nearly unified Japan. Yet in death, Nobunaga became myth, the ruthless dreamer, the modernizer, the demon king who burned a path for others to follow. But the story of unification did not die with him. His dream would pass to two men, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, his clever and loyal lieutenant, who would complete the conquest, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, his patient ally, who would turn conquest into peace. The age of chaos was nearing its end, yet the embers of Nobunaga's ambition still glowed, casting their light across the centuries. For in every age since, Japan has remembered him not just as a conqueror, but as the first to imagine a nation whole, a warrior who saw beyond battle to destiny itself. When the flames of Honnoji dimmed and the ashes of Oda Nobunaga scattered into the Kyoto wind, Japan trembled in uncertainty. The demon king was dead, his body reduced to smoke, and his empire, vast but incomplete, stood on the brink of chaos once again. His generals, once bound together by ambition, now eyed one another like wolves circling the carcass of a fallen lion. Yet amid this storm of power and betrayal rose a man whom few could have imagined as Nobunaga's heir, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a peasant by birth, a servant by chance, and a ruler by will alone. Hideyoshi's story was one of the most remarkable transformations in all of history. Born in 1537 to a poor farmer in Owari province, he began life far removed from the halls of nobility or the code of the samurai. As a youth, he was small, clever, and endlessly ambitious, earning the nickname Monkey from Nobunaga himself for his quick movements and mischievous grin. But Hideyoshi possessed something few men of his time did: unshakable resolve. Where others saw walls of class and bloodlines, he saw ladders to climb. Through cunning, diplomacy, and loyalty, he rose through Nobunaga's ranks, first as a sandal-bearer, then as a warrior, and finally as a general trusted to command armies. When news reached him that Nobunaga had been betrayed by Akechi Mitsuhide, Hideyoshi acted with speed that stunned even his allies. In a campaign known as the Chugoku March, he negotiated peace with his current enemies, gathered his forces, and raced toward Kyoto. In just 13 days, through rain, mud, and exhaustion, he covered over 200 kilometers to confront Mitsuhide. Their armies clashed at the Battle of Yamazaki, where Mitsuhide's troops, weary and disorganized, were crushed. The betrayer was killed soon after, either by peasants or his own despair. Nobunaga was avenged. But vengeance was only the beginning. Hideyoshi had inherited not Nobunaga's blood, but his dream, a Japan united under one rule. The next decade would test every ounce of his cunning. Though born without samurai lineage, Hideyoshi maneuvered with extraordinary grace through a world of prideful warlords. He married alliances, bent enemies into allies, and built loyalty through gifts, marriages, and the promise of stability. He waged wars not out of cruelty but precision, campaigns that cut through resistance with minimal waste, ending centuries of bloodshed not just through victory, but through peace. His crowning triumph came in 1590 at the Siege of Odawara, where the powerful Hojo clan made its last stand. For months, Hideyoshi surrounded the Hojo fortress, not with constant battle but with patience. He cut off supplies, built fortifications, and even held festivals outside the enemy's walls, a strange blend of warfare and celebration. When the Hojo finally surrendered, the last major opposition to Hideyoshi's rule was gone. Japan, for the first time in its history, was unified. The age of endless war had come to an end, and the peasant who had once carried sandals now ruled the land once ruled by gods and emperors. As Kampuku, or imperial regent, Hideyoshi wielded both political and symbolic power. He reshaped Japan's social order, freezing class mobility to prevent future uprisings, a bitter irony from a man who had risen from nothing. Samurai could no longer become farmers, and farmers could never again become warriors. He commissioned grand projects: Osaka Castle, gleaming with gold, magnificent tea ceremonies that blended politics and art, and censuses that counted the land's wealth and population with meticulous care. Yet beneath his peace lay ambition still unquenched. In his later years, Hideyoshi turned his gaze outward. He dreamed of conquering China and Korea, envisioning an empire that would place Japan at the center of the known world. In 1592, he launched the Imjin War, sending vast armies across the sea to Korea. At first, the campaign surged with victories, but it soon faltered. Korean resistance, Ming Chinese intervention, and logistical strain turned glory into catastrophe. His soldiers, far from home and weary of endless fighting, died by the thousands. As his health waned, so too did his dream. By 1598, Hideyoshi lay dying in his bed within the great castle of Fushimi. Outside, the empire he had built teetered between future and collapse. His last wish was for the safety of his young son, Hideyori, and the continuation of peace. But he knew the men who would guard that peace were wolves too, among them, a patient ally from the shadows, Tokugawa Ieyasu. When Hideyoshi breathed his last, the era of the common man's rise had ended. The peasant who had defied destiny, conquered Japan, and stood among the great rulers of the world passed into legend. His story was one of human will, proof that power could be earned not by birth, but by brilliance, and that in the heart of even the humblest man could burn the fire of an emperor. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi's final breath left the quiet chambers of Fushimi Castle, a stillness fell over Japan, the kind of silence that often precedes great storms. His armies had brought unity, his brilliance had forged order, but his death left behind a fragile peace balanced on ambition and deceit. The child heir he left, Hideyori, was far too young to rule. Around him gathered a council of the most powerful lords in the realm, men sworn to preserve the Toyotomi legacy. Yet among them stood one whose patience, restraint, and quiet cunning would shape Japan for centuries, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Born in 1543 in Mikawa province, Ieyasu had lived his entire life in the shifting tides of war. As a child, he was a hostage, traded like a piece on the board between rival clans. As a young man, he fought under Oda Nobunaga, watching closely as the unifier carved his empire from chaos. As a peer to Hideyoshi, he learned that strength was not always in the sword's swing, but in the long game of waiting. Where Nobunaga blazed like fire and Hideyoshi rose like the wind, Ieyasu moved like the earth, slow, immovable, inevitable. In the years after Hideyoshi's death, tension grew like cracks beneath the polished surface of peace. The lords of Japan, the daimyo, whispered, plotted, and shifted alliances in secret. Ieyasu, now the most powerful among them, began consolidating power from his base in Edo, the fishing village that would one day become Tokyo. His demeanor was calm, his words careful, but behind his serenity was a mind of perfect calculation. He befriended those who feared him and studied those who defied him. His patience was his weapon, his silence, his armor. The inevitable confrontation came in the year 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara, the clash that would decide the soul of Japan. On one side stood Ieyasu and his Eastern army, champions of stability and control. On the other stood Ishida Mitsunari and the Western forces, sworn to protect Hideyori's legacy. For months, Japan braced as armies gathered beneath banners that rippled like storm clouds. The valley of Sekigahara became a stage for destiny. On the morning of October 21st, mist blanketed the field. The cries of soldiers mingled with the drumming rain. As battle erupted, loyalty fractured. Daimyo switched sides mid-fight, swayed by Ieyasu's promises or by fear of his retribution. In a single day of blood and betrayal, the balance of Japan shattered. When the smoke cleared, Tokugawa Ieyasu stood victorious. Mitsunari was captured and executed. The Toyotomi cause, once a symbol of unity, was broken. From the chaos of war rose a new era. In 1603, Ieyasu was granted the title Seitai Shogun, the supreme military ruler of Japan. Yet unlike Nobunaga or Hideyoshi, Ieyasu sought not conquest but endurance. He had seen how ambition burned too brightly and consumed itself. Instead, he built something meant to last, the Tokugawa shogunate, a system of order that would govern Japan for over 250 years.